Welcome to Legacy of Throne. Tonight we are beginning a long journey across the islands of Japan, an archipelago of mountains, forests, rivers, and seas where human history stretches across tens of thousands of years. Japan today is a modern nation of immense cultural influence, known for its technology, its arts, its traditions, and its extraordinary resilience. But like every civilization, it began in the earlier stages of human settlement, with small groups of people creating a way of life from the resources that surrounded them. Our task in this series is to walk carefully through the entire story of Japan, from these first societies to the complexities of its modern age. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. And while you're listening, let me know in the comments where you are in the world and what time it is as you join us tonight. The first human presence in the Japanese islands can be traced back to the Paleolithic era, at least 35,000 years ago, and possibly considerably earlier, with some archaeological claims pushing the date of human habitation back as far as 100,000 years, though this remains contested. Stone tools, obsidian blades, and the remains of temporary shelters show that groups of hunter-gatherers crossed into the archipelago during the Ice Age, when sea levels were substantially lower than today, and the islands were more closely and continuously connected to the Asian mainland than they are now. The Korean Strait was narrower, the Sea of Japan was partially land or shallow water, and the passage of people and animals between the continent and the archipelago was a matter of practical geography rather than the demanding maritime journey it would later become. For tens of thousands of years, these early peoples lived by hunting large animals, including now extinct megafauna, by fishing the coastal waters and river systems, and by foraging the forests and grasslands of a landscape that was itself dramatically different from the Japan of historical times. The period we know as the Jōmon era begins around 14,000 BCE, a date that makes the Jōmon ceramic tradition one of the oldest known pottery-producing cultures anywhere on Earth, predating Chinese Yangshao ceramics, predating the pottery of the Fertile Crescent, and contemporary with only the very earliest ceramic traditions found in East Asia. The name Jōmon itself comes from the Japanese words for cordmark, referring to the distinctive patterns pressed into the wet clay surfaces of their pottery using twisted rope or cord before firing, creating the textured decorative impression that archaeologists in the late 19th century used to identify and name the culture. These vessels are not merely ancient curiosities. They represent a genuine technological and cultural achievement. The development of ceramic technology in the context of a hunter-gatherer society, demonstrating that pottery was not exclusively or even primarily an agricultural activity. Invention, but something that emerged from the practical needs of communities living by the sea, the forest, and the river. The Jōmon period extends until approximately 300 BCE, a span of more than 10,000 years. To appreciate the full significance of this duration, consider that it encompasses a longer, continuous cultural tradition than the entire distance in time between the fall of Rome and the present day, and then nearly double that again. For more than 10 millennia, the Jōmon people maintained their way of life across the Japanese archipelago with a remarkable degree of cultural continuity, adapting to changing environmental conditions, developing increasingly sophisticated technologies, and creating some of the most distinctive artistic and ritual objects of the prehistoric world without ever making the transition to full agricultural dependence that transformed almost every other complex prehistoric culture into a fundamentally different kind of society. The Jōmon people lived primarily as hunter-gatherers, but their societies displayed a sophistication and complexity that challenges any simplistic equation of hunting and gathering with primitive or undeveloped living. They constructed pit dwellings, semi-subterranean structures dug into the earth, roofed with wood and thatch, often arranged in clusters of 20 to 50 buildings that formed genuine villages rather than temporary camps. Excavations at major Jōmon sites across Japan reveal storage pits, communal hearths, open plazas apparently used for shared activities, and the organized spatial arrangements of settlements that suggest recognized authority and communal decision-making. These were not wandering bands of isolated families. They were communities with territorial identities, social structures, and the kinds of collective projects that require sustained organization. Food sources were varied, abundant, and carefully managed. The coastal sites and a remarkable proportion of Jōmon settlements were located near coasts, estuaries, or river mouths, show evidence of intensive exploitation of marine resources. Fish were caught in enormous quantities using a sophisticated toolkit of bone fish hooks, wooden weirs, nets woven from plant fiber, and dugout canoes capable of offshore travel. Shellfish were harvested from the tidal zones in quantities sufficient to produce some of the largest shell middens in the ancient world, enormous accumulations of discarded shells, animal bones, broken tools, and occasionally human burials that can rise several meters above the natural ground level and extend across areas of hundreds or even thousands of square meters. The Omori shell midden near modern Tokyo, first investigated by the American zoologist Edward Morse in 1877 in what became one of the founding investigations of Japanese archaeology, exemplified the scale of these deposits. More than 500 such middens have been identified across Japan, concentrated particularly along the coasts of Honshu, Kyushu, and Hokkaido. Inland communities hunted deer, wild boar, and smaller mammals with bow and arrow. The bow appears to have been in use in Japan as early as 12,000 years ago, among the earliest attestations of this technology anywhere. The forests provided an equally important component of the diet. Acorns, chestnuts, and walnuts were especially critical, harvested in autumn and stored in purpose-built pits, lined with leaves or bark to allow the slow fermentation that reduced their bitter tannic content and improved both palatability and digestibility. Grinding stones and the charred remains of processed plant foods confirm that nut processing was a significant economic activity. Evidence from some sites suggests small-scale cultivation or management of plants, including millet, barnyard grass, and gourds, not full agriculture in the sense of the Yayoi period that would follow, but something that sits in the interesting middle ground between foraging and farming, the active encouragement of useful plants in the immediate environment. Perhaps the most striking aspect of Jōmon material culture, and the feature that most clearly distinguishes it from other prehistoric cultures of comparable antiquity, is the extraordinary artistic quality of its ceramics. Early Jōmon vessels were functional shallow, pointed-bottom bowls apparently designed for cooking over an open fire, but relatively plain. By the Middle Jōmon period, which peaked around 2500 BCE and represents the cultural height of the entire era, pottery had evolved into something qualitatively different. The rims of vessels extended outward in elaborate sculptural patterns that serve no functional purpose whatsoever, cascading flanges, flame-like projections, spiraling forms that required genuine artistic planning and skill to execute. Surfaces bore densely interwoven geometric designs applied through multiple techniques. Some pots, clearly never intended for ordinary domestic use, were crafted with a care and attention that places them unambiguously in the category of ritual or ceremonial objects, valued for their aesthetic and symbolic qualities rather than their practical utility. The Jōmon dagu figurines are another extraordinary aspect of the culture. These small clay statues, most between 5 and 30 centimeters tall, typically portray human forms, predominantly female, with exaggerated or abstracted features that vary considerably across time and region. The goggle-eyed figurines of the late Jōmon period in northern Honshu, with their enormous circular eyes and strangely alien appearance, are among the most immediately recognizable objects of ancient Japanese art, reproduced in countless textbooks and museum displays. The distinctive goggle-eyed type, found extensively in the Tohoku region, may reflect some kind of spiritual or ritual vision. Large eyes, sometimes associated in shamanic traditions with the ability to see into invisible realms. Many dagu have been found broken deliberately, and the consistency of this pattern across different sites and time periods strongly suggests intentional ritual destruction rather than accidental damage. The most widely accepted interpretation holds that dagu were associated with healing rituals in which illness or misfortune was transferred into the figurine, which was then broken to release and destroy the negative influence. More than 15,000 dagu have been recovered from Jōmon sites across Japan, making them among the most abundant categories of prehistoric ritual object in East Asia. Settlements sometimes grew to considerable size by hunter-gatherer standards. The Sanimariyama site in Aomori Prefecture, excavated from 1992 onward and revealing one of the most complete and extraordinary Jōmon village, complexes ever discovered covered approximately 35 hectares and was occupied for approximately 1,500 years between roughly 3,900 and 2,300 BCE. Its excavators found evidence of approximately 500 pit dwellings in use over this period, 6 large pillar-supported, raised structures whose function may have been storage or communal ceremony, extensive garbage disposal areas organized by type of waste, and evidence of long-distance trade connections extending to sources of obsidian in Hokkaido, jade in Niigata Prefecture, and asphalt, used as adhesive, from deposits in the Akita region. The scale and organization of Sanimariyama challenges any comfortable assumption that complex social organization required agriculture as a prerequisite. Stone circles carefully arranged assemblages of upright or recumbent stones, positioned in deliberate patterns, appear at several Jōmon sites, most notably the Oyu stone circles in Akita Prefecture, where 2 concentric circular arrangements of stones, each approximately 45 meters in diameter, were constructed during the late Jōmon period. The stones were transported from river sources several kilometers away, requiring significant collective effort. Astronomical alignments have been detected in some stone circle sites' orientations toward the midsummer, sunrise or sunset that suggest the circles served as calendrical instruments as well as ceremonial spaces. These were not random arrangements, but carefully planned structures that demonstrate knowledge of seasonal astronomical patterns. The Jōmon period is divided by archaeologists into phases: incipient, initial, early, middle, late, and final, each characterized by changes in pottery style, settlement patterns, and environmental conditions. The Middle Jōmon period, of roughly 2,500 BCE, represents the cultural peak, the largest villages, the most elaborate ceramics, the greatest numbers of ritual objects. The late and final Jōmon phases show smaller and more dispersed settlements, simpler ceramic traditions, and evidence of adaptation to climate cooling that reduced the productivity of the nut-bearing forest environment on which many communities depended. But these changes did not represent collapse. Cultural continuity across the entire Jōmon span is striking. The fundamental ways of organizing life, producing food, creating objects, and managing relationships with the natural and supernatural worlds persisted with remarkable consistency across more than 10,000 years. The relationship between the Jōmon people and modern Japanese populations has been one of the most actively discussed questions in East Asian genetics. Studies using ancient DNA extracted from Jōmon skeletal remains have established that the Jōmon people were genetically distinct from the continental East Asian populations that would later arrive during the Yayoi period, characterized by specific genetic variants associated with populations of the ancient Asian continent's northeast, and showing relatively high genetic diversity consistent with long-term occupation of an isolated island environment. Modern Japanese people carry both Jōmon and Yayoi ancestry in proportions that vary by region. Populations in Okinawa and Hokkaido, the Ryukyuan, and Ainu peoples respectively carry the highest proportions of Jōmon ancestry, sometimes exceeding 60%, while mainland Japanese populations typically show ratios of roughly 40% Jōmon ancestry to 60% Yayoi-related ancestry. The Jōmon people did not disappear. They were partially absorbed into the agricultural society that replaced their way of life, leaving a permanent genetic and quite possibly cultural legacy in the modern Japanese population. The Jōmon period lasted more than 10,000 years. Few other cultures in human history achieved such longevity without dramatic shifts in social structure or economic foundation. The endurance of this way of life illustrates a genuine balance between people and environment sustained through ritual knowledge, community organization, and the deep ecological understanding that comes from thousands of years of intimate engagement with a specific landscape. The cord-marked pottery, the dagu figurines, the stone circles, and the immense shell middens stand as testimony to a society that found stability not in conquest or expansion, but in adaptation and continuity. The history of Japan begins here, with the people of the Jōmon, the first cultural foundation of the islands, establishing patterns of settlement, art, and spiritual relationship with the natural world that would echo across the centuries that followed. The transition from the Jōmon period to the Yayoi period marks one of the most profound transformations in the entire history of Japan. Where the Jōmon era was defined by hunting, fishing, gathering, and the long continuity of ritual and artistic life, The Yayoi period, lasting from approximately 300 BCE to 300 CE, introduced wet rice agriculture, bronze and iron metallurgy, and the first clearly recognizable social hierarchies. This shift was not a sudden replacement of one culture by another. For centuries, Jōmon traditions and Yayoi innovations coexisted and interacted across the archipelago, with the balance between them shifting gradually until, by the end of the Yayoi period, the agricultural way of life had become the dominant economic and social framework across most of Japan. The Yayoi period takes its name from a neighborhood in what is now the Bunkayo district of Tokyo, the area around Yayoi, near the modern campus of Tokyo University, where in 1884, excavations uncovered pottery of a style distinctly different from the elaborate cord-marked ceramics associated with Jōmon culture. Yayoi pottery is thinner-walled, more symmetrical, more consistently fired, and more practical in its design characteristics that reflect the priorities of a society in which pottery was primarily a utilitarian tool rather than a vehicle for artistic and ritual expression. This stylistic contrast, first identified by the pioneering Japanese archaeologist Tsubushi Shoyo and his colleagues in the late 19th century, was one of the first indications that a significant cultural transition had occurred in Japanese prehistory. The origins of the Yayoi transformation lie across the Korea Strait. By the first millennium BCE, populations in Korea and northern China had developed sophisticated agricultural systems centered on the cultivation of rice in flooded paddies, a form of agriculture uniquely productive in the warm, wet conditions of East Asia's river valleys and coastal plains. Wet rice cultivation, unlike dryland cereal farming, produces extraordinary yields from relatively small areas of land when properly managed, but it requires significant infrastructure investment. Level, water-retaining field surfaces, reliable irrigation systems drawing from rivers or rainfall, and the seasonal coordination of planting, flooding, drainage, and harvesting that demands communal labor organization. The knowledge and practice of wet rice agriculture spread southward and eastward from its probable origins in the Yangtze River Valley region of China during the preceding millennia, reaching the Korean peninsula and eventually crossing the narrow straits to the northern coast of Kyushu. Archaeological evidence places the earliest Yayoi wet rice cultivation in northern Kyushu at sites such as Itazuke near modern Fukuoka, where carbon-dated rice remains and paddy field traces have been found in contexts dating to approximately the 9th century BCE, making Yayoi-style agriculture somewhat earlier than the conventional 300 BCE date for the beginning of the Yayoi period, which reflects the point at which the new cultural complex became clearly dominant rather than the point of first appearance. Over the next several centuries, rice cultivation spread eastward and northward along the coastal plains and river valleys of Honshu, eventually reaching as far east as the Tokai and Kinai regions by the 1st century BCE. Northern Honshu and Hokkaido, with their cooler climates and shorter growing seasons, adopted rice cultivation more slowly or not at all, maintaining aspects of Jōmon subsistence longer than the core Yayoi zones. The introduction of rice cultivation altered the rhythm and structure of human life in ways that extended far beyond the simple fact of a new food source. The Jōmon lifestyle had been characterized by what ecologists call a diversified resource base, drawing on many different food sources across different seasons and environments, which created flexibility and resilience at the cost of the intensity that a specialized food production system could achieve. Rice agriculture required exactly the opposite approach. Deep investment in a specific form of land use, the construction and maintenance of irrigation infrastructure, the coordination of labor across an entire agricultural community for the critical periods of planting and harvest, and the management of grain storage to sustain the community through the winter months between harvests. Villages became genuinely permanent, fixed to their paddies and irrigation systems in a way that Jōmon settlements, however long occupied, had never been. The creation and maintenance of paddy fields represented a substantial capital investment in the land that could not simply be abandoned and recreated elsewhere. Grain surpluses created by productive rice agriculture had social consequences that rippled through every aspect of Yayoi society. Where Jōmon communities had been characterized by relatively modest differences in material wealth between individuals as reflected in burial, practices that show limited variation in the quantity and quality of grave, goods Yayoi burials display dramatically greater differentiation. Elite graves from the Middle and Late Yayoi period contain bronze mirrors, sometimes dozens of them, imported from China or manufactured in Japan using Chinese techniques, iron swords, daggers, and arrowheads, glass and jade beads, bronze bells and ritual vessels, and decorative objects of shell and bone that represent both considerable material value and access to long-distance exchange networks. Ordinary Yayoi burials contain none of these things. The emergence of a materially privileged elite is one of the clearest signals that social conditions for political hierarchy and eventually state formation were taking shape. Bronze and iron technology appeared in Japan with the earliest Yayoi migrants and traders, representing the first use of metals in the archipelago. Bronze objects, mirrors, swords, spearheads, and the remarkable dotaku bells were imported initially from the Korean peninsula and China, then manufactured locally using imported techniques. The dotaku are among the most distinctive and enigmatic objects of Yayoi archaeology. These large bronze bells, the largest examples exceeding 130 centimeters in height, are decorated with elaborate geometric patterns, and on the most elaborate examples, with remarkably vivid scenes of daily life. People hunting deer with bows, fishing from boats, and pounding grain in mortars. More than 400 dotaku have been discovered, concentrated in the Kinai and Tokai regions of central Honshu, often buried in groups on hillsides or mountain slopes away from settlements. They appear to have been ritual objects rather than functional bells. They are too large and heavy for easy use, and their internal construction is not optimized for sound production. The scenes depicted on their surfaces provide some of the most detailed visual documentation of Yayoi daily life available to archaeologists. Iron technology, arriving alongside bronze, was adopted primarily for functional tools. The knives, axes, hoes, and harvesting sickles that made agricultural work more efficient, as well as the weapon swords, spearheads, and arrowheads that increasingly equipped Yayoi warriors. The simultaneous appearance of both bronze and iron in the Japanese archaeological record distinguishes Japan from the pattern seen in most of Western Eurasia, where a Bronze Age clearly preceded an Iron Age by centuries or millennia. In Japan, both metal technologies arrived together during the Yayoi period, suggesting rapid cultural transmission from mainland contexts where both were already established. The Chinese historical records of the Three Kingdoms period, particularly the Weijia section of the Sanguo-jai, compiled by the scholar Chen Shu around 280 CE, contain the most detailed early written accounts of Japan, referred to in Chinese as Wa, a name that appears to derive from a Chinese designation for the people of the islands. According to the Weijia, Wa was divided into more than 100 small kingdoms or communities at the beginning of the Common Era, which had been in a state of warfare before achieving some measure of unification under a queen named Himiko. She is described as a skilled practitioner of spirit possession and shamanic ritual who maintained authority through religious leadership, remaining unmarried and served by 1,000 female attendants in her palace, while a single male brother handled political communications with the outside world. Around 239 CE, Himiko sent an official mission to the court of the Wei Emperor in China, receiving in return official recognition, the title Queen of Wa friendly to Wei, bronze mirrors, and gifts of silk and other luxury goods. The location of Himiko's kingdom of Yamato has been debated by Japanese scholars for centuries without definitive resolution. The two main contenders are northern Kyushu, where the earliest and most intense Yayoi archaeological activity is concentrated and where Chinese contacts would have been most natural, and the Kinai region around modern Nara and Osaka, which is the area where the later Yamato state would develop. The debate continues because the travel directions and distances given in the Weijia are mutually contradictory when applied to the actual Japanese geography. What is not in doubt is that by the late Yayoi period, Japan contained recognizable political entities of sufficient scale and organization to appear in Chinese diplomatic records as significant political partners, kingdoms with rulers, hierarchies, ritual specialists, and the ability to send formal diplomatic missions across the sea. The 3rd century of the Common Era brought a decisive turn in the history of Japan. From the scattered chiefdoms and rival communities of the Yayoi period, a new political center began to form in the fertile Nara basin of central Honshu, a region of river, plains, and surrounding hills that offered both agricultural productivity and strategic defensibility, well positioned to control communication routes between the coastal and inland areas of central Japan. This development is known as the rise of the Yamato state, a process through which power gradually concentrated under a dominant ruling lineage that bound subordinate groups together through a combination of military prestige, religious authority, marriage alliances, and the remarkable symbolic power of the burial mound tradition. The most immediately striking feature of this period is the appearance across the Japanese landscape of Kofun, the great burial mounds that give the entire era from roughly the 3rd through 7th centuries its name. These structures range from relatively modest mounds, a few meters high and a few tens of meters in length, built for local elites in provincial areas, to genuinely monumental earthworks that rank among the largest burial structures ever created by human labor anywhere in the world. The most famous, and the largest of all, is the Daisen Kofun in Sakai, Osaka Prefecture, traditionally attributed to the Emperor Nintoku, though modern scholars recognize that attributions connecting specific mounds to specific legendary emperors are problematic, based on later tradition rather than contemporary documentation. The Daisen Kofun stretches approximately 486 meters in length, with a maximum width across its rectangular rear section of approximately 305 meters. It is surrounded by 3 concentric moats and a total of 84 subsidiary burial structures associated with attendants or family members. From the air, its distinctive keyhole shape, a feature unique to Japanese burial architecture, combining a circular mound at the rear with a trapezoidal or rectangular apron extending from the front, is immediately recognizable. By volume of earth moved, it rivals the Great Pyramid of Giza as one of the largest single construction projects of the ancient world. The contents of these burial mounds provide the most direct evidence of the society that built them. The burial goods of the Great Kofun include bronze mirrors, sometimes imported from China, sometimes locally manufactured copies of iron swords, spearheads and arrowheads, representing military power, elaborately crafted personal ornaments of jasper and jade, clay figures called haniwa arranged around the exterior of the mound depicting warriors, priests, horses, boats, houses, and occasionally dancing figures that may represent ritual performance, and the occasional importation of prestige objects from Korea and continental China, demonstrating the far-reaching exchange networks that connected the Yamato elite to the broader East Asian world. Bronze mirrors were objects of particular symbolic significance. They appear in enormous numbers in Yayoi and Kofun period elite burials, sometimes hundreds in a single grave, and their reflective surface connected them to the sun goddess Amaterasu in later Japanese religious thought. The political structure of the early Yamato state revolved around the organization of powerful clans, the Yujai, each with its own ancestral deity, its own territorial base, and its own leader. Below the Yuji were the occupational groups of artisans, farmers, ritual specialists, and craftspeople attached to specific clans and performing specialized functions within the broader social order. The Yamato court gradually established dominance over this network of clans by placing loyal leaders in key administrative positions, by demanding tribute and labor from subordinate groups, by managing the distribution of the prestige goods, particularly the bronze mirrors that served as symbols of recognized status within the political hierarchy, and by cultivating religious authority through the claim to descent from Amaterasu, the sun goddess who occupied the highest position in the Japanese divine order. This claim that the Yamato ruling lineage stood in direct genealogical relationship to the most powerful deity in the cosmos provided a legitimacy that transcended any temporary military or economic advantage. Chinese and Korean contacts deepened significantly during this era. The great Chinese dynasties of the period, the Wei, the Western Jin, and then the southern dynasties all received Japanese diplomatic missions and issued formal recognitions that enhanced the prestige of the Yamato court at home by demonstrating its participation in the prestigious international order of East Asian civilization. From Korea, divided during this period among the kingdoms of Goguryeo in the north, Baekje in the southwest, and Silla in the southeast, came iron in enormous quantities, horse-riding technology, and the skills of immigrant specialists in metalworking, weaving, and administration, who settled in Japan and contributed to the development of Yamato court culture. It was from Baekje, in particular, that the most consequential cultural transmission of all, would eventually arrive. The 6th century brought to Japan a religious and cultural transformation that will permanently reshape its history and continue to reverberate in Japanese life to the present day. Until this point, Japanese spiritual life had been organized around what scholars now call Shinto, though this term was not actually used at the time, and the practices it eventually came to describe were not yet conceptualized as a unified religion, but existed as a collection of localized beliefs, rituals, and relationships with the natural and supernatural world. Kami spiritual presences inhabiting rocks, mountains, rivers, trees, notable landforms, and the forces of weather and season were venerated through offerings, prayers, and ritual observances conducted at sacred sites under the authority of clan leaders who combined political and priestly functions. Ancestral spirits maintained active relationships with the living, demanding respect and providing protection in return for proper veneration. Shamanic intermediaries, often women, facilitated communication between the human and divine worlds. Into this spiritual world arrived Buddhism, a fully developed religious and philosophical system of the highest intellectual sophistication, originating in northern India in the 5th century BCE with the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama and spreading across Asia over the following centuries along the trade routes of the Silk Road and the maritime connections of the Indian Ocean. By the time it reached Japan, Buddhism had already been thoroughly adapted to East Asian cultural conditions through centuries of development in China and Korea, acquiring Chinese language scriptures, Chinese-style temple architecture, Chinese-influenced iconography, and the institutional structures of monastery and clergy that would make it immediately comprehensible to Japanese observers familiar with continental civilization. The transmission is traditionally dated to the year 552 CE, though some scholars argue for 538 CE based on alternative textual evidence. According to the Nihon Shoki, the Japanese chronicle compiled in 720 CE, the king of Bika, seeking to strengthen diplomatic ties with the Yamato court, sent an official mission bearing a bronze image of the Buddha Shakyamuni, copies of sutras, and trained monks to explain the new teaching. The gift was simultaneously diplomatic and religious, presenting Buddhism as a prestigious cultural treasure associated with the most advanced civilizations of Asia, and inviting the Yamato court to join the community of Buddhist nations that already included China and the Korean kingdoms. The response at the Yamato court was deeply divided. The Soga clan, powerful, well-connected to continental immigrants, and deeply invested in the administrative and cultural innovations that Buddhism brought with it, championed the new religion with enthusiasm. The Mononobe and Nakatomi clans resisted it, arguing that Japan's own native kami would be offended by the worship of foreign deities and that the spiritual balance of the realm depended on maintaining the traditional religious order over which these clans held ceremonial authority. This was not a purely theological dispute. It was simultaneously a political competition for influence over the Yamato court, with Buddhism serving as the banner under which the Soga prosecuted their struggle for dominance against rival clans who benefited from the existing religious system. The conflict eventually resolved in the Soga's favor through a combination of political maneuvering and military victory. Their decisive champion was Prince Shōtoku Mayado no Oji, known posthumously as Shōtoku Taishi, the son of Emperor Yomai by a Soga mother, who served as regent for his aunt Empress Suiko from approximately 593 CE and became one of the most influential figures in all of early Japanese history. Shōtoku was, by the account of both Japanese chronicles and Chinese diplomatic records, a man of exceptional intellectual breadth and administrative vision. He committed himself to Buddhism with genuine personal conviction, studying the scriptures in depth and producing commentaries on the Vimalakirti Sutra, the Lotus Sutra, and the Queen Esakutramala Sutra that demonstrate real philosophical engagement with Buddhist thought rather than merely political opportunism. The Horyōji temple complex that Shōtoku commissioned near Nara, constructed beginning around 607 CE and surviving in substantially original form to the present day as one of the oldest wooden building complexes in the world, stands as the physical monument to his religious commitment and cultural ambition. The 5-story pagoda and the main hall of the western precinct date to the 7th century and represent the finest surviving examples of Asuka period Japanese architecture, heavily influenced by Korean Baekje building traditions but already developing distinctly Japanese characteristics. The interior of the main hall contains some of the most important Buddhist sculptures in all of Japanese art, including the famous Shakyamuni Triad, cast in bronze around 623 CE by the sculptor Toribushi, which combines Sui dynasty Chinese aesthetic influences with a formal elegance that would become one of the foundations of the Japanese Buddhist sculptural tradition. Shōtoku's 17-article constitution, promulgated in 604 CE, was not a legal code in Maya, the modern sense, but a document of moral and political philosophy, drawing on Buddhist, Confucian, and native Japanese principles to articulate the ethical foundations of good governance. Its famous opening article, "Harmony should be valued and discord avoided," established the principle of social concord as the foundation of political order. Its second article explicitly declared reverence for the three treasures, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, as a duty of all. Its subsequent articles elaborated principles of loyalty, honesty, impartiality, and diligence in official service drawn from the Confucian tradition. By linking political order to Buddhist ethics and Confucian social philosophy simultaneously, Shōtoku was articulating a vision of Japanese civilization as part of the broader East Asian cultural sphere, a participant in the continental order of ideas, not an isolated exception to it. The arrival of Buddhism also initiated a transformation of Japanese artistic and intellectual life that extended far beyond religious practice. Buddhist temples required sculptors capable of producing images of the Buddha and bodhisattvas in bronze, wood, and lacquer. They required architects able to construct the elaborate multi-story wooden buildings of Chinese-derived design that temple architecture demanded. They required painters for the murals that adorned temple interiors. They required scribes able to copy the Chinese language sutras that formed the literary foundation of Buddhist practice. They required musicians for the elaborate ritual music of the monastic tradition. Meeting all of these needs brought to Japan a community of Korean and Chinese craftsmen and scholars, whose skills seeded the development of new Japanese artistic traditions over the following generations. The 7th century was a defining era in which the foundations of Japanese statehood were laid with unprecedented deliberateness. After the arrival of Buddhism and Prince Shōtoku's articulation of a new political philosophy, the Yamato court moved decisively toward centralization, modeled on the continental examples of the Tang dynasty in China, which had unified China under a sophisticated administrative system in 618 CE and represented the most advanced political organization in the world. The period known as the Asuka era, named after the region in the southwestern corner of the Nara Basin, where the court was located, witnessed the first systematic effort to transform Japan from a loose coalition of powerful clans into a genuinely centralized state. At the heart of this transformation were the Taika reforms of 645 CE, Taika meaning great change, a name that acknowledged the scale of what was being attempted. The reforms were initiated in the aftermath of a dramatic palace coup in which the Soga clan, which had dominated Yamato court politics for generations, was violently overthrown by an alliance between the young Prince Nokonoo, later Emperor Tenji, and the nobleman Nakatomi no Kamatari, who would be posthumously honored as the founder of the Fujiwara clan. The coup took the form of a dramatic assassination during a court ceremony, with the Soga leader Soga no Iruka cut down before the empress herself. With the Soga eliminated and their monopoly on power broken, the reformers announced a sweeping program of institutional change. The reforms were explicitly modeled on Tang dynasty China's systems of governance, which the Japanese envoys known as Kentoshi, the envoys to the Tang, had been studying through regular diplomatic missions beginning in the early 7th century. These missions were extraordinarily ambitious enterprises for the period, crossing approximately 900 kilometers of open ocean in wooden sailing ships with no reliable navigational technology and a historically documented mortality rate that makes their persistence a testament to the intensity of Japan's desire for continental knowledge. Of the 19 officially recorded Kentoshi missions between 630 and 894 CE, several were struck by storms that killed many of the participants, yet the missions continued, carrying Japanese students and monks to China for years or decades of study and returning with texts, techniques, and cultural models that were systematically implemented in Japan. The central principles of the Taika reforms included the nationalization of all land, declaring that all territory belonged to the emperor. and could not be privately owned by clans or individuals in perpetuity, and the reorganization of provincial administration along Chinese lines. New administrative units called kuni, provinces, and gun, districts or counties, were established, each to be governed by officials appointed by and responsible to the central court rather than by hereditary clan leaders whose loyalty was personal and local rather than institutional and national. A comprehensive census was to be conducted to provide the basis for systematic taxation. Every household was to be assessed and taxed in rice, cloth, and labor according to the number of persons it contained. Officials were to be ranked in a formal hierarchy modeled on the Tang system, with responsibilities and privileges defined by law rather than by birth or clan connection. The land nationalization reform was the most radical element of the entire program. Under the Ritsario system, the legal administrative framework developed through the Teiko reforms and subsequently elaborated in the Teiho Code of 701 CE and the Yoro Code of 718 CE land was to be distributed to households under the so-called equal field system borrowed from Tang China, with plots allocated based on household size and reclaimed by the state on the death of the recipient rather than passing to heirs as private property. This was an extraordinary assertion of state power over private interests, and its implementation was inevitably partial and uneven. The clans that had controlled land for generations did not surrender it quietly, and the administrative machinery required to enforce the system consistently across the entire archipelago simply did not yet exist. But the symbolic power of the declaration was immense. Japan was asserting, for the first time, the principle of ultimate state sovereignty over the land itself. The Asquai era also witnessed the emergence of Japan's first genuine, written historical and cultural self-consciousness. The compilation of the Kojiki in 712 CE, the record of ancient matters, the oldest surviving book in the Japanese language, and the Nihon Shoki in 720 CE, the Chronicles of Japan, composed in classical Chinese, represented the first systematic effort to organize Japan's myths, genealogies, and historical traditions into a coherent national narrative. Both works record the elaborate creation mythology of Japan. The cosmogonic union of the divine couple Izanagi and Izanami, the birth of the islands from their creative activity, the emergence of the sun goddess Amaterasu as the supreme deity of the divine order, and the descent of the imperial lineage from Amaterasu through a series of divine and semi-divine generations. These narratives served multiple functions simultaneously. They provided a theological foundation for imperial authority, a coherent account of Japanese origins that distinguished Japan as a land of divine creation rather than mere historical accident, and a cultural record that preserved the oral traditions of the clans in permanent written form. The 8th century opened a new chapter in Japanese history. After the institutional reforms of the Asuka era and the intellectual achievements of its historical compilations, the Yamato court sought to embody its authority not only in law and ritual, but in the permanent, visible form of a great capital city, a physical statement of civilizational achievement that would make immediately legible to any observer Japan's claim to equality with the imperial powers of the continent. This ambition led to the construction of Japan's first permanent planned capital, Hyokayo, established in 710 CE on the site of what is now the city of Nara, and gave the entire period from 710 to 794 CE its name. The Nara period. Prior to this decision, the Japanese court had maintained the practice of relocating the imperial residence, with each new reign a custom rooted in beliefs about ritual pollution, specifically the idea that the death of an emperor rendered the palace space impure and required the establishment of a new residence before the next reign could properly begin. As a practical consequence, earlier capitals were relatively temporary structures, elaborate palace compounds that rose and fell within a generation, creating no permanent urban accumulation and leaving behind little more than the earthen remains of post holes and drainage ditches that archaeologists now identify through careful excavation. The decision to establish Hyokayo as a permanent capital was therefore a significant cultural statement as well as an administrative choice. Japan was declaring that the impermanence of the past would give way to the permanence of an established imperial center. Hyokayo was laid out on a grid plan modeled directly on Tang Dynasty Chang'an, then the largest city in the world with a population estimated at perhaps 1 million people, following the Chinese cosmological principle of the city as a microcosm of the ordered universe. A broad central avenue, the Suzaku Avenue, ran north-south from the main southern gate to the imperial palace compound that occupied the northern end of the city's central axis. The city measured approximately 4.5 kilometers from east to west and roughly 5 kilometers from north to south, divided into systematically organized blocks of residential, commercial, and administrative function. Government offices were arranged in order of hierarchical rank on either side of the central avenue. Two official markets, the Eastern Market and the Western Market, provided regulated commercial activity. Buddhist temples, noble residences, and artisan workshops filled the surrounding blocks. At its height, Hijokyo may have housed a population of approximately 200,000 people, making it by far the largest urban settlement that had yet existed on Japanese soil. The most impressive physical achievement of the Nara period was the Great Todijai Temple, complex commissioned by Emperor Shamu, one of the most devout rulers in Japanese history, a man whose Buddhist faith was not merely political theater, but genuine personal conviction. Construction began in 745 CE, following a series of national disasters, smallpox epidemics, crop failures, and natural catastrophes that Shamu interpreted as signs of divine displeasure, requiring a major act of religious merit. The centerpiece of Todijai was the Daibotsudan, the great Buddha hall, which was, and remains today, the largest wooden building in the world. Approximately 57 meters tall, approximately 50 meters wide, and approximately 50 meters deep. Within it was placed the great bronze Buddha, the Roshana Buddha, corresponding to the cosmic Buddha, Vairocana, who in the Flower Garland Sutra is described as the embodiment of the Dharma, permeating all of existence, cast in bronze at a height of approximately 14.5 meters, making it the largest bronze statue in the world at the time of its creation. The casting of this immense figure consumed approximately 437 tons of bronze, required 60 separate pourings, and involved the labor of specialized craftsmen from across Japan and imported Korean expertise in bronze casting technology. Shamu's religious program extended beyond Nara to the entire country through the Kokyubanji system, a requirement, established in 741 CE, that each of Japan's 60-odd provinces construct and maintain an official provincial temple, Kokyubanji, and its female counterpart, Kokyubaniji, each staffed with resident monks and nuns responsible for conducting regular ritual services for the protection of the province and the empire. These temples were to receive regular rice allotments from their provinces, tax revenues, and maintain copies of the Lotus Sutra, the Golden Light Sutra, and other protective texts. The system was simultaneously an exercise in centralized religious administration and a network of state legitimization, extending the emperor's spiritual authority to every corner of the realm. The Nara period produced two of the foundational texts of Japanese literary culture. The Kojiki, compiled in 712 CE under the direction of the scholar Omacron no Yasumaro from oral traditions, recited by the court remembrancer Hida no A, presents the mythological and legendary history of Japan from the creation of the Four Islands through the reign of Empress Suwaiko in a text that mingles poetry and prose, myth and history, in a style that, despite being ostensibly composed in Chinese characters used phonetically to represent Japanese, retains something of the oral poetic tradition from which it derives. The Nihon Shoki of 720 CE, composed entirely in classical Chinese for an audience that included Chinese diplomats, presents the same material in a more formal analytic style that self-consciously presents Japan as a civilization comparable in prestige and historical depth to China. Together, they work together to achieve a common goal. These two texts constructed the official narrative of Japanese origins and imperial legitimacy that would serve as the ideological foundation of the imperial institution for centuries. The Manyoshu collection of 10,000 leaves, compiled in the latter part of the 8th century, represents the other great literary achievement of the Nara period and one of the greatest achievements of Japanese literature in any era. Containing over 4,500 poems in both waka short verse form and choka long verse form, the collection ranges across the full spectrum of Japanese society. Poems by emperors and empresses appear alongside verses attributed to frontier soldiers, fisherwomen, and peasant farmers. The emotional range is equally broad: passionate love lyrics, elegies for the dead, descriptions of natural landscapes, expressions of longing for home during official journeys, and philosophical reflections on the impermanence of life. The collection was compiled using a phonetic system of writing using Chinese characters purely for their sound value to represent Japanese words that became known as Manyogana and was the ancestor of the hiragana and katakana syllabaries that are still used in Japanese writing today. In the year 794 CE, the Japanese court made what would prove to be one of its most consequential decisions: the relocation of the imperial capital from Nara to a new site approximately 40 kilometers to the north, in the fertile valley between the Kamo and Katsura rivers. The new capital, Heian-kyo, the capital of peace and tranquility, was, like its predecessor, laid out on a Chinese cosmological grid plan, but larger and more carefully sited, positioned in a basin surrounded on three sides by mountains and open to the south in Ta. The geomantically favorable configuration prescribed by Chinese feng shui principles. The city that grew on this site over the following centuries, known eventually as Kyoto, would serve as the formal imperial capital of Japan for more than 1,000 years. From 794 to 1869 CE, the decision to abandon Nara was motivated primarily by the desire to escape the growing institutional power of the Buddhist establishment centered on Todijai and the other great Nara temples. The most alarming precedent of the late Nara period had been the affair of the monk Dokyo, a Buddhist priest of considerable spiritual reputation, who gained the personal devotion of Empress Shōtoku to the point where he wielded effective political power at court and was reportedly even considered as a candidate for the imperial throne itself. Dokyo was expelled from court after Empress Shōtoku's death in 770 CE, but the episode had demonstrated with alarming clarity that religious institutions with accumulated wealth, political connections, and the prestige of the Buddhist Dharma could threaten the independence of the imperial institution itself. Moving the capital to Heian-kyo, where no major Buddhist temples yet existed, was partly an act of political hygiene, creating distance between the throne and the institutional power of the Nara establishment. The Heian period, that extended from the capital's founding in 794 to the effective end of aristocratic dominance in 1185 CE, is remembered above all as the golden age of Japanese aristocratic culture, a civilization of extraordinary aesthetic refinement, literary achievement, and social elaborateness that has few parallels anywhere in the world at the same historical moment. The court society that developed at Heian-kyo over the following 3 centuries was organized around a set of values and practices: sensitivity to beauty, mastery of artistic expression, awareness of the emotional resonances of natural phenomena and the passage of seasons, and the cultivation of an aesthetic consciousness called aware or no-aware, the pathos of things that were simultaneously personal virtues, social accomplishments, and political currencies. In a court where rank determined everything: the size of one's residence, the colors one was permitted to wear, the number of layers in one's costume, the distance from the imperial presence at which one could stand, cultural refinement was the medium through which individuals competed for prestige and influence. The instrument through which the Fujiwara clan was the most powerful aristocratic family of the Heian period, descended from the Nakatomi no Kamatari, who had helped overthrow the Soga clan in 645 CE, maintained its dominance over the imperial court, was the system of regency. Beginning with Fujiwara no Yoshifusa in 858 CE, who became regent, Sessho, for the child emperor Seiwa, despite not being the emperor's father or grandfather, a precedent that shocked the court. The Fujiwara perfected the technique of marrying their daughters to emperors, ensuring that the heir to the throne was a Fujiwara grandson, and then serving as regent during the resulting emperor's childhood and as Kampaku, chancellor, after his maturity. For most of the Heian period, the Fujiwara effectively governed Japan in the emperor's name, while the emperor remained the sacred center of the ritual and cultural universe of the court, without exercising real political power. The peak of Fujiwara dominance came under Fujiwara no Michinaga, who controlled the court from approximately 995 to 1027 CE, and whose confidence in his own position was captured in a famous poem comparing himself to the full moon at its height, unclouded and lacking for nothing. The cultural achievements of the Heian period are genuinely extraordinary by any standard of literary and artistic achievement. The tale of Genji Monogatari, composed by Murasaki Shikibu, a lady-in-waiting at the court of Empress Shoshi in the early 11th century, is routinely described as the world's first novel, and with justification. It follows the long life of the shining Prince Hikaru Genji, the son of an emperor who is demoted to commoner status and must make his way through the intricate social and emotional world of the Heian court through his personal brilliance, his numerous love relationships, and his sensitivity to the aesthetic and emotional dimensions of experience. Written in a prose of exceptional subtlety and psychological depth, capturing the interior emotional states of its characters with intimacy and precision that would not be matched by any novel in any tradition for centuries. The Genji is approximately 1,000 pages in modern English translation and encompasses approximately 75 years of narrative time across 3 generations. The scholar Ivan Morris called the world it depicts the world of the shining prince, and the term captures something essential about Heian culture. Its celebration of a particular kind of brilliance that was simultaneously aesthetic, emotional, and social. Sei Shonagon, a contemporary of Murasaki Shikibu, who served at the court of Empress Tashi rather than Empress Shoshi, the 2 empresses representing rival Fujiwara factions in a court where personal and political competition were inseparable, produced in her pillow book, Makura no Soshi, one of the most distinctive works in Japanese literary history, a collection of observations, lists, anecdotes, and reflections on court life that is organized not narratively but associatively, moving between lyrical descriptions of natural beauty, acerbic observations of social behavior, lists of things that make one's heart beat faster or make one feel depressed, and vivid accounts of specific incidents at court. The pillow book gives us an unmediated sense of the texture of daily Heian aristocratic life, the elaborate ceremonies, the competitive poetry exchanges, the complex etiquette of romantic relationships conducted through screens and curtains, the genuine aesthetic pleasure taken in the first snow of winter or the sound of crickets at night that no more formally composed historical source can provide. Waka poetry, the classical Japanese short verse form, consisting of 31 syllables arranged in a papa 7-5-7-7 pattern, was the primary medium of cultural and social communication in Heian aristocratic life. The Kokin Wakashu of 905 CE, the first imperial anthology of Japanese poetry, compiled at the command of Emperor Daigo and organized by the great poet Kai no Tsurayuki, established the aesthetic standards and the thematic organization by season, then by love, then by miscellaneous topics that structured Japanese poetry anthologies for the following 1,000 years. Tsurayuki's famous Japanese preface to the anthology, the Kana Preface, Kanaho, is the first extended piece of literary criticism in Japanese and articulates the fundamental principle of waka aesthetics, that poetry takes its seed in the human heart, expressed outward in the 10,000 things of the world, so that anyone who has known love or sorrow, who has seen cherry blossoms fall or heard the sound of autumn rain, can find in poetry both expression and recognition of what they have experienced. The closing centuries of the Heian period revealed deep changes in Japanese society that the brilliance of court culture was not sufficient to conceal. While the aristocracy of Kyoto refined its sensibility through poetry, calligraphy, and elaborate ritual, the balance of power in the provinces was shifting toward a new social class whose values, skills, and social organization differed fundamentally from those of the court world. These warriors, known eventually as samurai, from a verb meaning to serve, began as estate guards and provincial enforcers, men employed by aristocratic and religious institutions to protect their land holdings and maintain the order that the central government's weakening administrative machinery could no longer reliably provide. They gradually coalesced into a recognizable hereditary class whose influence would eventually reach from local property disputes to the determination of who ruled Japan. The origins of the samurai class lie in the structural failure of the Ritsario system that had been introduced with such ambition during the Asuka and Nara periods. The system's central premise that all agricultural land belonged to the emperor and would be redistributed every 6 years based on population was never effectively implemented across the full extent of the Japanese archipelago, and from the late 8th century onward, the reality of private land accumulation consistently outpaced the official ideology of state ownership. Wealthy aristocratic families, powerful religious institutions including both Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines, and eventually the most successful provincial landholders all accumulated private estates, shun, that were in practice exempt from the central government's taxation and labor conscription systems. By the 10th century, shun covered a substantial proportion of the agricultural land of central and western Japan, and the income from these estates flowed not to the imperial treasury, but to the aristocratic and religious institutions that owned them. To defend and manage these estates against both natural threats and human competitors, landowners required men with specific skills: horsemanship, archery, familiarity with weapons, the physical endurance to travel and campaign across difficult terrain, and the organizational ability to command small groups of armed followers. These requirements produced over generations a specialized occupational class whose skills were passed down within families, creating recognized lineages of fighters whose hereditary military expertise gave them a distinct social identity. Provincial governors dispatched from the capital to administer their assigned provinces typically had no military training or local knowledge, while the locally rooted warrior families knew their terrain intimately and commanded the loyal service of extended networks of subordinate fighters. The practical military authority thus rested with the warriors rather than with the officially appointed administrators. The emergence of the samurai as a socially and politically significant class accelerated through two major crises of the mid-10th century: the Yōhei and Tengyō rebellions of the 930s and 940s. Terra no Masakado, a warrior of imperial descent who had built a powerful military following in the Kanto region of eastern Japan, went to war with related families over an inheritance dispute and ultimately declared himself new emperor in 939 CE, seizing control of 8 eastern provinces. Almost simultaneously, Fujiwara no Sumitomo, a former imperial official who had turned pirate lord in the inland sea, was conducting large-scale raids against government shipping. The Kyoto court, possessing no standing military forces of its own, was compelled to commission other warrior leaders, Fujiwara no Hidesato and Terra no Sadamori in the east, Fujiwara no Tadabumi in the west, to suppress these rebellions. Both were defeated by 941 CE, but the episode demonstrated unmistakably that the security of the imperial court now depended on the military capabilities of provincial warrior families, over whose loyalty the court had no guaranteed hold. The contrast that developed between the court world and the provincial warrior culture produced one of the most productive cultural tensions in Japanese history. The Heian court valued sensitivity, aesthetic refinement, poetic skill, and the subtle negotiation of social hierarchies. Provincial warrior culture valued martial skill, physical endurance, loyalty to one's lord, and the pragmatic competence needed to manage land, followers, and conflict in the often violent world of the provinces. These values were not simply opposites. Warrior leaders competed for prestige, partly through cultural accomplishment, and court aristocrats who wished to exercise actual power increasingly needed the backing of military men. But the tension between them produced, over several centuries, a synthesis that would eventually define what it meant to be Japanese in the age of the samurai. By the 11th and 12th centuries, two warrior clans had emerged as the dominant military forces in Japan. The Terra, also known as the Heike, and the Minamoto, also known as the Genji, were both descended from imperial princes demoted to commoner status, a common practice when imperial families grew large and the treasury could not support unlimited numbers of imperial relatives in the style appropriate to their birth. Both clans had built their power bases through provincial military service, extended networks of warrior retainers bound by feudal loyalty, and the strategic acquisition of landholdings that gave them the economic resources to sustain large armed followings. Their rivalry, which built across decades of political competition and occasional violent confrontation, would eventually consume the entire country in the war known as the Genpei War. The 12th century reached its climax in a conflict that forever altered the trajectory of Japanese history. The struggle between the Terra and Minamoto clans, the Genpei War, marked the end of the Heian period and the beginning of military rule. What began as a rivalry between aristocratic warrior families escalated into a nationwide civil war, concluding in 1185 with the decisive triumph of the Minamoto. And out of this victory arose Japan's first true military government, the Kamakura Shogunate. The Genpei War formally began when Prince Mochihito, a son of the retired Emperor Go-Shirakawa, who had been passed over for succession in favor of a Terra-supported candidate, issued a call to arms in 1180 against the dominance of Terra no Kiyomori. Kiyomori had achieved extraordinary influence over the court, placing his relatives in high offices, marrying his daughter to Emperor Takakura, and effectively ruling Japan in the manner that the Fujiwara had previously dominated, through control of the imperial family rather than through openly claimed personal authority. But where Fujiwara dominance had been accepted by a court culture that valued precisely the kind of aristocratic family politics the Fujiwara practiced, Terra dominance by a warrior family struck many at court as a violation of the natural order. Kiyomori's arrogance and his willingness to use military force against opponents had alienated precisely the people whose cooperation was essential to stable governance. The Minamoto response to Mochihito's call was led primarily by Minamoto no Yoritomo, a man of mature strategic judgment who had spent his youth in exile in the Kanto region following his family's defeat in the Heiji disturbance of 1159, and who used his years of obscurity to cultivate the network of Eastern warrior relationships that would become the foundation of his military power. Yoritomo's genius was organizational rather than personally military. He established his headquarters at Kamakura, a small coastal settlement in the Kanto region, chosen for its defensible terrain and its distance from the corrupting atmosphere of Kyoto court politics, and built around it the administrative machinery of what would become the first shogunate, the Bakufu, or tent government, even before the Genpei War was won. The military execution of the war was carried out largely by Yoritomo's younger relatives, above all his brilliant half-brother Minamoto no Yoshitsune, whose tactical genius produced some of the most celebrated victories in Japanese military history. At the Battle of Aikinotani in 1184, Yoshitsune launched a daring cavalry assault down a precipitous cliff face, a move so unexpected that the Terra commanders were caught off guard, had left the cliffside unguarded, and broke the Terra defensive position at what is now the western edge of modern Kobe. The victory became legendary, celebrated in later literature and theater as an example of the combination of courage, daring, and improvisational genius that defined the ideal warrior. At the Battle of Yashima on the Sanuki coast of Shikoku in the same year, Yoshitsune again surprised the Terra by crossing in a storm, his sailors reportedly terrified to sail in such conditions, and forced the naval force onto the defensive. The final confrontation came at the Battle of Dan-no-Yura in the Shamanowski Strait in April 1185, a naval engagement in the narrow, current-swept waters between Honshu and Kyushu, where the Terra made their last stand, carrying with them the child Emperor Antoku and the three sacred imperial regalia, the mirror, the sword, and the jewel that embodied the divine legitimacy of the imperial house. The battle's outcome was determined partly by the defection of Terra no Noritsune, fleet commanders to the Minamoto side, and partly by the tactical genius of Yoshitsune, who reportedly ordered his archers to target the enemy steersmen, targeting individuals below the expected dignity of warrior-on-warrior combat, but devastating in its effectiveness against an enemy whose ships were suddenly unmaneuverable in treacherous currents. The Terra commander Tomomori attached an anchor to himself and walked into the sea rather than face capture. Antoku's grandmother, the Nine-Oama, took the 7-year-old emperor in her arms and stepped off the deck of the imperial vessel into the water, taking with her the sacred sword, one of the 3 imperial regalia, which was never recovered. The pearl-handled sword's loss was lamented in court poetry for generations. The Kamakura Shogunate that Yoritomo formally established with his appointment as Sei Teishogun, literally barbarian subduing generalissimo, in 1192 CE, represented a genuinely novel form of Japanese governance, the first military government, the first time that the actual power of state had formally and openly resided with a warrior, rather than being exercised through the fiction of aristocratic court authority. The shogunate administered Japan through a system of military governors, shugo, placed in each province, and estate stewards, jito, placed on individual shun, creating a network of warrior officials whose primary loyalty was to Kamakura rather than to Kyoto. The imperial court and its aristocratic institutions continued to exist in Kyoto, continued to perform their ritual functions, their cultural activities, their poetry contests and seasonal ceremonies, but their practical authority had definitively been superseded. Yoritomo's own sons proved incapable of maintaining the authority he had built. The first shogun died in 1199 after falling from a horse, and his sons Yori and Sanetomo both died violently within the following decade. Sanetomo assassinated at the great Tsurugaoka Hachimangu shrine in Kamakura in 1219 by his nephew, who was himself immediately killed by a bodyguard. With the Minamoto male line extinguished, power passed to the Hojo family, the family of Yoritomo's widow Masako, who was often called the Ba. Nun shogun, in recognition of the extraordinary political authority she exercised after taking religious vows following her husband's death. As regents, shikken, governing in the name of a succession of puppet shoguns drawn from the imperial family and then from the Fujiwara clan, the Hogo controlled the Kamakura Shogunate for the rest of its existence. In the 13th century, Japan confronted a threat unlike any it had faced before. The Mongol Empire under Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan and founder of the Yuan dynasty. That replaced the Song dynasty in China was the largest contiguous land empire in world history, stretching from Korea to Poland, from the Persian Gulf to Siberia. By the 1260s, Kublai Khan had consolidated his control over China and turned his attention toward the remaining independent states of East Asia. Japan, he believed, should submit as a tributary, acknowledging Mongol supremacy and sending regular payments of goods and personnel to the Yuan court as recognition of their subordinate status. In 1266 CE, he dispatched envoys to Japan through Korea, demanding exactly this. The Kamakura Shogunate, governed through the Hogo Regency at this time by Hogo Tokimune, a man of remarkable composure and determination who reportedly prepared himself for the invasions through intensive Zen meditation, rejected the demand without negotiation. Further envoys followed in 1268 and subsequent years, each dismissed. The stage was set for the most serious external military threat Japan would face until the 20th century. The first invasion came in November 1274. A Mongol-led force composed of Mongol, Chinese, and Korean soldiers, estimated at approximately 28,000 troops, carried in approximately 900 ships, landed at Hakata Bay on the northwestern coast of Kyushu. The Japanese forces that met them on the beaches faced opponents who fought in ways they had never encountered. Massed infantry formations using coordinated archery and spearwork rather than the individual combat between named champions that the Japanese warrior tradition emphasized. Explosive projectiles, gunpowder bombs, called tetsuhao, iron balls packed with gunpowder and shrapnel that burst with fire and noise over the heads of the defenders, terrifying both men and horses, and the tactical discipline of Mongol-trained soldiers who advanced in organized units, rather than the self-advertising individual charges of the samurai ideal. Japanese accounts describe warriors riding forward to announce their names and lineages, the ritual opening of formal combat only to be met with arrows from massed archers who had no interest in individual duels. Despite these initial shocks, Japanese fighters adapted quickly and fought with determined effectiveness, particularly in the night raids launched in small boats by coastal samurai who attacked the anchored Mongol fleet and killed officers and crew aboard the ships. The Mongols, after a day of fighting that produced heavy losses on both sides, withdrew to their ships that night, possibly to regroup, possibly having achieved their reconnaissance objectives for a preliminary operation, and a storm struck the fleet during the night, sinking a significant number of vessels and forcing the abandonment of the invasion. The Japanese credited their survival to divine intervention. The wind that scattered the Mongol fleet was a gift from the gods protecting the divine islands. The Kamakura Shogunate did not wait passively for the inevitable second attempt. Over the following 7 years, the government mobilized unprecedented national resources for coastal defense. A stone wall approximately 200 meters long and over 2 meters high was constructed along the shoreline of Hakata Bay, specifically designed to prevent the cavalry disembarkation that Mongol amphibious tactics required. Samurai warriors from across Japan were mobilized and stationed along the Kyushu coast on rotating guard duty at enormous expense. Naval forces were organized to intercept any landing force before it could establish itself ashore. The second invasion of 1281 was vastly larger than the first, so large that it remains, by some measures, among the largest naval expeditions in pre-modern world history. 2 separate fleets were dispatched: the Eastern Route Army of approximately 40,000 men in approximately 900 ships sailing from Korea, and the Jungnan Army of approximately 100,000 men, infantry from the recently conquered Song dynasty, in approximately 3,500 ships sailing from the ports of southern China. Together, these forces represented perhaps the greatest single concentration of military power directed against Japan in any period before the 20th century. If they had successfully united and landed, the Kamakura Shogunate's ability to resist would have been severely challenged, if not overcome. The stone wall at Hakata Bay performed its function. Mongol cavalry could not disembark effectively in the face of the fortifications, and fighting around the beaches produced heavy losses without a decisive breakthrough. For approximately 50 days, the invasion forces remained largely offshore, unable to establish the beachhead that full-scale operations required, while Japanese samurai in small boats conducted constant harassing attacks on the fleet. Japanese documents from the period record a series of daring night raids in which small groups of warriors rowed out to the anchored fleet, boarded individual vessels, and fought their way through the decks before escaping with prisoners and captured weapons. These raids were militarily significant in disrupting Mongol command and killing experienced officers, but more importantly, they demonstrated that Japanese fighting spirit and adaptability could achieve results against a numerically overwhelming enemy. Then, in early August of 1281, a typhoon of extraordinary severity, a late-season tropical cyclone of the type that can generate sustained winds exceeding 150 kilometers per hour, struck Kyushu directly. The Mongol fleet, crowded with troops and still largely at anchor offshore, was utterly devastated. Japanese accounts suggest that the typhoon raged for 2 days and that approximately 4,000 ships were destroyed or damaged beyond use, with casualties among the invasion force estimated at anywhere from 40,000 to 100,000. Dead figures that, even at the more conservative end, represent military losses on a scale rarely seen in medieval warfare. The survivors who made it ashore were hunted down and killed or captured by samurai forces. Kublai Khan's armies had been destroyed not by Japanese military genius, but by the Japanese climate. The Japanese named the storm Kamikaze, divine wind, and the concept became one of the most powerful in the national religious consciousness. The belief that Japan was protected by a special divine favor that would send catastrophic natural forces against any enemy who dared to attack the sacred islands. This belief, emerging from the specific events of 1281, would have profound and ultimately tragic consequences when it was invoked again, more than 6.5 centuries later, in the context of the Second World War. The military and financial consequences of the Mongol invasions for the Kamakura Shogunate were severe despite the successful defense. Warriors mobilized from across Japan had fought at enormous personal expense, expecting the traditional reward of confiscated enemy land that was the normal compensation for military service. But since Japan had successfully defended its territory rather than conquered new lands, there was nothing to distribute. The Ho-Ho Regency found itself unable to compensate warriors for years of service and sacrifice, creating deep resentment within the very warrior class whose loyalty was the foundation of shogunal authority. The wealth and authority of the Hojo regents themselves became a focus of anger as warriors increasingly perceived the system as one that channeled the kingdom's resources to a narrow clique while ordinary samurai went unrewarded. The Kamakura period was not only a turning point in Japanese political history, but an age of deep cultural and spiritual transformation. While the shogunated Kamakura held authority in the political and military sphere, the realm of thought, art, and religious life was being reshaped by a profound new influence from the continent. Zen Buddhism. The arrival and rapid spread of Zen altered the character of Japanese culture in ways that extended far beyond the walls of temples, reaching into the ideals of the warrior class, the design of landscapes and architecture, the aesthetics of painting and poetry, and the philosophical outlook that has underpinned Japanese culture in many respects ever since. Zen, known as Chan in its Chinese homeland, was introduced to Japan primarily through the efforts of 2 monks. Ise, 1141 to 1215, who studied at a Chan monastery in China and returned to establish the Rinzai school of Zen in Japan, founding the Keninjai Temple in Kyoto in 1202, and Dogen, 1200 to 1253, one of the most profound philosophical minds in Japanese history, who also traveled to China and returned to establish the Soto school, eventually settling at the remote Aihaji Temple in the mountains of Echizen province, far from the competitive politics of both Kyoto and Kamakura. Between them, These two founding figures established the two main streams of Zen Buddhism that continue to define the tradition in Japan to the present day. The appeal of Zen to the samurai class was not coincidental. Zen's emphasis on direct experience over scriptural study, on disciplined physical practice as a path to spiritual insight, on the acceptance of impermanence and the ability to act decisively in the moment, all resonated with the psychological demands of a warrior's life in ways that neither the elaborate esoteric rituals of Shingon nor the devotional recitations of Pure Land Buddhism quite matched. The physical practice of zazen, seated meditation, trained the mind in stillness, focus, and the release of clinging to particular outcomes, cultivating exactly the qualities that samurai aesthetics idealized in a warrior. The ability to face death without flinching, to make decisions instantly under extreme pressure, to be able to think clearly and make decisions quickly under pressure, to act completely in the present moment rather than calculating consequences. Zen masters who spoke of cutting through ordinary mental confusion with the sword of direct insight were speaking a language that warrior patrons recognized as their own. The monastic architecture that Zen Buddhism introduced to Japan became one of the great aesthetic achievements of the Kamakura and subsequent Muromachi periods. The great Zen temple complexes of Kamakura Kenchō-ji, founded in 1253, and Goku-ji, founded in 1282, following the Mongol invasions as a memorial to the warriors killed in the path, established a distinctive architectural grammar that reflected Zen values of simplicity, functional clarity, and the careful management of the relationship between built space and natural landscape. The characteristic features of Zen temple layout, the straight axial approach road, the succession of gates leading to the main worship hall, the meditation hall, zazen-do, positioned alongside the main axis, and the precisely managed garden spaces between buildings created environments whose purpose was specifically to cultivate a particular state of mind in anyone who moved through them. The Keisansui dry landscape garden, one of the most immediately recognizable and widely admired contributions of Zen aesthetics to world culture, emerged from Zen philosophical principles about the nature of perception and the relationship between the visible and the invisible. By eliminating water, vegetation, and the conventional markers of picturesque natural beauty from the garden space and replacing them with carefully arranged rocks and raked gravel, the dry garden creates a space whose meaning is produced entirely by the mind of the viewer. The waves in the gravel exist only as perception. The mountains in the stone arrangement are not mountains, but rocks that the mind recognizes as mountain-shaped. The islands are stones in an ocean of raked stone. This radical reduction of representational content to minimal elements, forcing active perceptual participation from the viewer, embodies the Zen principle that emptiness is not absence, but the condition of possibility, that the mind that can rest in openness, rather than filling every space with its own interpretations, can perceive reality directly. The famous Ryoangi Garden in Kyoto, created probably in the late 15th century, though its exact history is uncertain, represents the tradition at its most refined and most enduringly compelling. 15 carefully placed stones arranged in 5 groups, set within a rectangular field of white gravel approximately 25 meters long and 10 meters wide, surrounded by low earthen walls. The arrangement is designed so that from any single viewing position within the traditional seated viewing area, only 14 of the 15 stones are visible at one time. This perpetual incompleteness, the impossibility of seeing the whole all at once, has been interpreted in many ways. But most fundamentally, it enacts the Zen principle that reality cannot be grasped in a single comprehensive view, that perception is always partial, and that wisdom lies not in achieving total comprehension, but in accepting the limitations of any single perspective. The fall of the Kamakura Shogunate in 1333 marked the end of Japan's first experiment with warrior rule, but it did not bring stability. The attempt by Emperor Go-Daigo to restore genuine imperial authority, the Kenmu Restoration of 1333 to 1336, collapsed within 3 years when it became apparent that Go-Daigo intended to reward his most loyal supporters generously while reorganizing Japan along lines that ignored the interests of the warrior class that had made the restoration possible. Ashikaga Takagi, who had led the forces that destroyed the Kamakura Shogunate, turned against the emperor, captured Kyoto, and established a new military government, the Ashikaga Shogunate, also known as the Muromachi Shogunate, from the Muromachi district of Kyoto, where its headquarters were eventually established in 1338. The Ashikaga Shogunate lasted until 1573, encompassing one of the most artistically fertile and politically chaotic periods in Japanese history. Its central contradiction was visible from the beginning. Unlike the Kamakura Shogunate, which had maintained substantial central control through the Shugo and Jito system, the Ashikaga Shogunate relied heavily on alliances with powerful regional lords whose support was conditional, and whose own regional ambitions were constantly in tension with shogunal authority. The shoguns of the Ashikaga dynasty were often powerful cultural patrons and occasionally capable military leaders, but they never achieved the kind of systematic administrative dominance over the provinces that would have made their government genuinely stable. The third Ashikaga shogun, Yoshimitsu, who held the position from 1368 to 1394 and continued to exercise enormous influence until his death in 1408, was in many ways the peak of Ashikaga achievement and certainly the most culturally influential figure the dynasty produced. Yoshimitsu re-established formal diplomatic and commercial relations with Ming Dynasty China in 1401, accepting from the Ming court the title King of Japan, in a tributary relationship that shocked many Japanese purists but brought enormous economic benefits through the officially regulated trade known as the tally trade, Kango Boki, that it authorized. He constructed the Kinkakujai, the Golden Pavilion, its upper 2 stories covered in gold leaf beside a pond garden in the northern outskirts of Kyoto, creating one of the most recognizable architectural images in all of Japanese culture, a building that combined Zen aesthetic principles with the display of wealth and power in a way that encapsulated the contradictions of the period. The original building burned in 1950, an act of arson by a disturbed monk that Mishima Yukio memorably fictionalized. The present building is a 1955 reconstruction based on careful historical documentation. No theater reached its definitive artistic form under Ashikaga patronage, developed above all through the genius of Zimimoto Kiyo, 1363 to 1443, the actor and playwright who wrote approximately half of the 240 or so plays that form the core no repertoire, and who composed the theoretical texts, the Fushikaden, the Kakayo, and others that articulate the aesthetic principles underlying the art form with a core philosophical depth unmatched in any other tradition of performance theory before the modern era. Zimi's central concept, yugen, the quality of mysterious grace or subtle profundity that great Mo performance achieves, was something that could not be directly defined or technically produced, but had to be cultivated through years of mastery until it emerged naturally in performance. His description of the ideal actor's development through life, from the charm and freshness of childhood performance through the technical mastery of middle age to the austere, pared-down simplicity of the great artist in old age, remains one of the most moving accounts of artistic development in any tradition. The 15th century, closed with Japan, plunged into one of the most turbulent eras in its history. The Onin War, which began in 1467 as a dispute over succession within the Ashikaga shogunate and quickly escalated into a 10-year military catastrophe that reduced the capital of Kyoto to ruins, shattered what little governing coherence remained under Ashikaga authority. The armies of 2 rival warlord coalitions, the Eastern Army under Hosokawa Katsumoto and the Western Army under Yamanasozen, fought through the streets and neighborhoods of the imperial capital for a decade, burning temples, monasteries, and aristocratic residences by the hundreds, driving the court nobility into poverty and exile, and demonstrating with terrible clarity that the Ashikaga regime could no longer maintain even the semblance of central control. What followed the Onin War was the Sengoku period, the Warring States era, a designation borrowed from a comparable period of Chinese history during which central authority virtually ceased to exist and Japan fragmented into a patchwork of competing territorial domains, each controlled by a warlord, daimyo, who exercised effective sovereignty within his territory through force, administrative competence, and the cultivation of samurai loyalty. The Sengoku period lasted roughly from the 1460s through the 1580s, a century and more of nearly continuous warfare during which the political map of Japan was redrawn continuously as domains were conquered, absorbed, and reorganized under the control of whoever proved most capable of combining military effectiveness with administrative talent. The military character of the Sengoku period drove far-reaching changes in the organization and technology of warfare. The traditional image of the samurai as an individual mounted warrior engaging in formalized combat against named opponents, the model that still dominated the military culture of the early Heian and Kamakura periods, gave way to the reality of mass infantry armies of ashigaru, foot soldiers, whose coordinated spear formations and disciplined archery were far more effective in large-scale battles than the individual cavalry charges of the old warrior ideal. Sengoku daimyo competed intensively to recruit, equip, and train large numbers of infantry, transforming warfare from a relatively small-scale contest between warrior elites into something closer to the mass military mobilizations of early modern Europe. The arrival of Portuguese traders at the island of Tanegashima off the southern coast of Kyushu in 1543 introduced the final element of military transformation: firearms. The Portuguese harquebuses, Tanegashima, immediately impressed Japanese observers, their penetrating power against armor and their range surpassing any bow made. They clearly superior weapons in many tactical situations, and within years, Japanese blacksmiths had produced domestic copies, and daimyo were commissioning firearms in significant numbers. By 1575, the Battle of Nagashino demonstrated definitively the tactical revolution that firearms had produced. The social mobility that the Sengoku period created was extraordinary by the standards of any previous era. Men of low birth could rise through military talent, organizational skill, and personal courage to positions of authority that would have been inconceivable in the rigidly hierarchical world of the Heian or Kamakura periods. The most striking example, and the one that would have the most lasting consequences, was the rise of Toyotomi Hideyoshi from the son of a peasant foot soldier to the ruler of a unified Japan. But Hideyoshi's trajectory was only the most dramatic instance of a broader pattern. The Sengoku period was an era in which hereditary status counted for less and demonstrated ability counted for more than any other period in Japanese history before the 20th century. The long century of the Sengoku period began to narrow toward unification by the mid-16th century under a series of extraordinary leaders who recognized that the fragmented territorial competition of the Warring States era could not continue indefinitely, and that the concentration of military and administrative power under a single authority was both possible and necessary. The first of these leaders was Oda Nobunaga, a daimyo from Ori province in central Honshu, whose combination of tactical brilliance, institutional innovation, and ruthless strategic vision broke the cycle of Sengoku deadlock and began the process that would culminate in Japanese unification. Nobunaga was born in 1534. The heir to a relatively modest domain whose geographic position in the central Honshu heartland, where major roads intersected, was strategically significant, but whose military resources were modest compared to the great powers of the age. His early career gave little indication of the trajectory ahead. Contemporary accounts describe a young man of unconventional habits who wore his kimono tucked up above his knees, went barefoot in the castle, ate while walking, and generally showed a disregard for the elaborate etiquette of samurai society that his more tradition-minded retainers found alarming. The contradictions were revealing. Behind the calculated eccentricity was a mind of exceptional analytical clarity and psychological boldness that would repeatedly commit to actions others considered suicidal. The Battle of Okazama in 1560 established Nobunaga's national reputation overnight. Imagawa Yoshimoto, one of the most powerful daimyo of the age, controlling 3 provinces and commanding a force estimated at between 25,000 and 40,000 troops, was marching toward Kyoto through Owari, apparently intending to use his military superiority to impose himself as the dominant power in central Japan. Nobunaga, commanding perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 men, was advised by his generals to take a defensive position inside Kiyasu Castle and negotiate. Instead, he launched a rapid attack on the Imagawa headquarters encampment during a sudden violent thunderstorm that masked his approach and confused the enemy response. Yoshimoto, apparently believing the commotion was a drunken brawl among his own troops, emerged from his tent and was killed by 2 of Nobunaga's samurai before he understood what was happening. The psychological effect of Yoshimoto's death, the elimination of one of Japan's most formidable daimyo by a numerically insignificant opponent in a matter of minutes, was enormous and immediate. set. The alliance Nobunaga formed with Tokugawa Ieyasu, then a young daimyo of Mikawa province, whose domain bordered Owari, proved one of the most durable and consequential strategic partnerships in Japanese history. Both men recognized that their geographic proximity made cooperation more advantageous than conflict, and both had the pragmatic intelligence to maintain that cooperation across decades of upheaval when short-term temptations to defect existed. Nobunaga provided the aggressive forward momentum, Ieyasu provided the eastern flank security and the steady, reliable military support that allowed Nobunaga to concentrate his energy on his campaigns westward and northward. Nobunaga's march into Kyoto in 1568, nominally undertaken to support the candidacy of Ashikaga Yoshiaki as shogun, appeared initially to represent a conventional seizure of court patronage of the kind that powerful daimyo had pursued throughout the Sengoku period. But Nobunaga's relationship with the institution he was ostensibly supporting was always predatory. He used Yoshiaki as a puppet legitimizing his presence in the capital while systematically building the institutional framework of his own authority, establishing free markets, rakuichi rakuza, that abolished the toll barriers and guild monopolies that had restricted commercial activity, reorganizing the cadastral system of land measurement to create a more accurate tax base, and developing a sophisticated administrative hierarchy staffed by men whose primary qualification was competence and loyalty rather than hereditary standing. When Yoshiaki attempted in 1573 to act as an independent political actor by soliciting daimyo opposition to Nobunaga, Nobunaga expelled him and the Ashikaga Shogunate ended. The Battle of Nagashino in June 1575 demonstrated Nobunaga's tactical genius and his willingness to deploy military technology in ways that transcended conventional samurai values. The Takeda clan, whose heavy cavalry under the recently deceased Takeda Shingen had been considered the finest offensive military force in Japan, deployed in the classic style of Sengoku cavalry assault, advanced against Nobunaga's positions under the command of Shingen's son Katsuyori. Nobunaga had prepared a specific counter, approximately 3,000 arquebusiers, harquebus-equipped foot soldiers, positioned behind wooden stockades, organized into rotating firing lines, so that while one rank fired another was reloading, maintaining continuous fire rather than the single volley, followed by a lengthy reload period that made individual firearms far less effective than their potential. The Takeda cavalry, committed to the attack by Katsuyori's overconfidence, was shattered by sustained firearms fire in a battle whose outcome demonstrated to every observer in Japan that the era of traditional cavalry tactics had ended. The destruction of the Ikoiki, the leagues of militant Buddhist followers organized around the Jodo Shinshu, true Pure Land, sect, was one of the most controversial aspects of Nobunaga's career. These organizations, particularly powerful in the provinces of Kaga, Echizen, and around the great Ishiyama, Honganjai fortress in Osaka, combined genuine religious devotion with effective military organization, controlling significant territories and posing real threats to Nobunaga's political consolidation. Nobunaga treated them with a ruthlessness that shocked even by the standards of the Sengoku period. The burning of the great Enryakuji complex atop Mount Hiei in 1571, home of the Tendai Buddhist establishment that had for centuries been one of the most important religious and cultural institutions in Japan, killed thousands of monks, nuns, lay workers, and civilians, and destroyed a complex of hundreds of buildings that had been the center of Buddhist learning for nearly 800 years. The historical debate over whether this act was a calculated elimination of a genuine military threat or an act of wanton sacrilege continues to this day. Nobunaga's end came on the 21st of June 1582 at the Hanoji Temple in Kyoto, where he was staying with a small guard while his armies were engaged in campaigns elsewhere. One of his most trusted and capable generals, Eiichi Mitsuhide, whose motives remain genuinely obscure to historians, surrounded the temple with his forces and attacked. Nobunaga, recognizing that escape was impossible, reportedly drew back into the inner chambers and set the temple ablaze, dying in the fire at the age of 49. The suddenness of his death and the shock it produced across Japan was commensurate with the scale of what he had accomplished. The destruction of the medieval order, the foundation of an administrative and military system that his successors would inherit, and the demonstration that Japan's unification was achievable. The sudden death of Oda Nobunaga in 1582 created a vacuum at the very center of Japan's fragile march toward unification. Into this turbulent moment stepped Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a man of extraordinary talent and ambition, whose rise from peasant origins to ruler of Japan remains one of the most remarkable personal trajectories in world history. Hideyoshi was born in 1537 in Nakamura, in Owari province, the son of a peasant foot soldier who had briefly served as an ashigaru in the Oda forces before illness forced his retirement. Unlike virtually every other significant figure in Japanese history, Hideyoshi had no warrior lineage, no inherited land, no aristocratic connections, and no family network of loyal retainers. He entered service with Nobunaga at the lowest possible level and rose entirely through demonstrated ability. Contemporary accounts describe Hideyoshi as physically unimposing, short, thin, with reportedly simian features that earned him the nickname Saru, monkey, from Nobunaga, but possessed of extraordinary energy, personal charm, and a gift for understanding other people's motivations and exploiting them. He was a logistical genius who managed supply chains and construction projects with efficiency that made him invaluable to Nobunaga long before he demonstrated his military capabilities. His negotiating skills were equally remarkable. He preferred to avoid battles whenever possible, understanding that a diplomatic settlement that gave an opponent an honorable exit cost far less in resources and reliable loyalty than a military victory followed by permanent resentment. When news of Nobunaga's death at Hanajai reached Hideyoshi, then conducting a siege in western Honshu, he made a decision of audacious speed. Within days, he had concluded a rapid peace agreement with his opponents, turned his army around, and marched back east at extraordinary pace. He confronted and defeated Eikichi Mitsuhide at the Battle of Yamazaki barely 13 days after Nobunaga's death, a timeline that would have seemed physically impossible to contemporaries, and publicly claimed the role of avenging retainer, the man who had most rapidly and decisively acted to punish his master's killer. This positioning was both genuinely emotionally motivated and brilliantly calculated. It established Hideyoshi as the legitimate successor to Nobunaga's cause before any other potential claimant could organize. The subsequent years saw Hideyoshi consolidate control through a combination of military campaigns and diplomatic maneuvers so skillful that many contemporary observers, including some of his opponents, found themselves admiring his technique even as they submitted to his authority. His siege of Bichu Takamatsu Castle, using a daikand water flooding technique to inundate the castle without bloodshed, demonstrated an engineering and organizational creativity that was characteristic of his approach. Achieve results while minimizing the physical destruction and resentment that protracted combat produces. His victory at the Battle of Shizugatake in 1583, establishing dominance over the other senior Oda retainers who might have challenged his succession, and the subsequent resolution of his standoff with Tokugawa Ieyasu through negotiation rather than continued warfare, showed the same pattern. Use force when necessary, but prefer the outcome that leaves former opponents as functioning contributors to the new order rather than as permanently embittered enemies. By 1590, when the Hojo clan's surrender of their fortress at Odawara, besieged by an army estimated at over 200,000 men, the largest military mobilization in Japanese history, to that point marked the end of the last significant military resistance, Hideyoshi stood as the undisputed master of a unified Japan. His domestic reforms after unification were systematic and consequential. The sword hunt, Katonagari, of 1588 CE, which required the confiscation of weapons from all non-samurai throughout Japan, was simultaneously a practical security measure and an ideological statement. It defined the samurai monopoly on legitimate violence with legal precision, establishing that the social distinction between warrior and non-warrior was not merely traditional, but enforced by the authority of the central state. The land surveys, Teiko Kenchi, conducted between 1582 and 1598, measured the productive value of every agricultural field in Japan using standardized units and measurement techniques, creating the most accurate cadastral survey the country had ever possessed and providing the information base for a rational system of taxation that replaced the chaotic patchwork of historical claims and exemptions that had accumulated across the medieval period. Hideyoshi's foreign ambitions, the invasions of Korea in 1592 and 1597, represented the most hubristic overreach of his career and ended in what can only be described as catastrophic failure despite the initial military successes. The first invasion force of approximately 160,000 troops crossed to Korea in May 1592, and within weeks had captured Seoul and Pyongyang, sweeping aside Korean resistance in a rapid advance that seemed to validate Hideyoshi's vision of conquering Korea as a stepping stone to China. Then, the situation reversed. Korean resistance organized under commanders of genius, above all Admiral Ye Sun-sin, whose turtle ships, Geobuxian, the first ironclad warships in the world, with iron plate-covered hulls that protected them from the Japanese incendiary arrows and firearms, systematically destroyed Japanese naval supply capabilities, cutting off the invasion force from its logistical base in Japan. Ming Dynasty China intervened with a substantial army, forcing the Japanese northward. A peace negotiation collapsed when it emerged that the two sides had fundamentally misunderstood each other's terms. The second invasion of 1597 went worse than the first. Hideyoshi's death in August 1598 ended the Korean adventure. The expeditions had consumed enormous resources, produced no lasting territorial gains, devastated Korean society, and left Japan with military debts and political tensions that would contribute to the final conflict for supremacy. The death of Toyotomi Hideyoshi in 1598 left Japan at a crossroads. The country was unified for the first time in more than a century, but bound together by the personal authority of a man who had no legitimate dynastic lineage, and whose young heir Toyotomi Hideyori was 5 years old. The Council of 5 regents appointed to govern in Hideyori's name until he came of age was a structure of political instability waiting to collapse. 5 powerful men with conflicting interests and mutual suspicions, nominally committed to collective governance, but in practice competing for supremacy from the first moment. Tokugawa Ieyasu was the most experienced and the most strategically capable of the regents. His biography, before Sekigahara, was a study in patience, strategic restraint, and the long-term management of political relationships. Born in 1543 in the small domain of Mikawa as Matsudaira Takeo, he had spent his childhood as a political hostage, first with the Oda, then with the Imagawa, learning in extended confinement the value of waiting for the right moment and the danger of premature action. His adult career as Nobunaga's ally, then Hideyoshi's subordinate, had been shaped throughout by the same principle. Accept temporary disadvantage to position for eventual advantage, cultivate relationships that might prove useful years in the future, and never overextend in pursuit of immediate gains that might provoke a coalition too powerful to resist. In the years following Hideyoshi's death, Ieyasu moved carefully. He arranged marriages between his family and those of other powerful daimyo, formally violating Hideyoshi's prohibition on such arrangements without council approval, a deliberate provocation designed to test how the other regents would respond and to build alliances that would prove decisive in the coming conflict. The Western daimyo, particularly those who had served most closely with Hideyoshi in his Korean campaigns and resented the Eastern Tokugawa bloc, organized opposition around Ishida Mitsunari, Hideyoshi's brilliant but politically tone-deaf chief administrator. By the summer of 1600, the division between the Eastern and Western coalitions was military rather than merely political, and both sides mobilized for the decisive confrontation. The Battle of Sekigahara on October 21, 1600, was the largest battle in Japanese history, fought in the Mino Province Valley between mountains that compressed the opposing armies into a relatively narrow battlefield. Perhaps 80,000 troops on the eastern side faced approximately 100,000 on the western, though the actual engaged forces were smaller than these numbers suggest, as many units held back or had not yet arrived. The decisive factor was not tactics or fighting quality. Both sides were composed of experienced Sengoku warriors, but the secret negotiations that Ieyasu had conducted in the months before the battle with several Western coalition commanders, offering promises of land and recognition in exchange for defection or inaction at the critical moment. Kobayakawa Hidaki, commanding approximately 17,000 men on a hill overlooking the Western Army's flank, had been cultivated by Ieyasu for months. When he failed to commit his forces at the expected moment, holding back in apparent uncertainty, Ieyasu reportedly ordered his own arquebusiers to fire harassing shots toward Kobayakawa's position, forcing a decision. Kobayakawa attacked downhill into the Western Army's flank. His defection triggered a cascade. Other wavering Western commanders chose the winning side and turned on their former allies. The battle that had been a genuine contest became a rout within hours. Ishida Mitsunari was captured fleeing through the mountains 3 days later and was executed in Kyoto, along with other Western leaders. The aftermath of Sekigahara was managed with the systematic strategic intelligence that characterized everything Ieyasu did. More than 80 daimyo lost their domains in the redistribution that followed, their lands confiscated and redistributed to Tokugawa allies in configurations that maximized Tokugawa security. The most potentially dangerous domains, the Tozama, or outside lords, whose families had opposed Ieyasu at Sekigahara, were moved to peripheral regions and isolated from each other by the interposition of loyal feudai, inside lord, domains, while the Tokugawa themselves and their close relatives acquired the largest single block of domains in the country, controlling approximately a quarter of Japan's total agricultural productivity directly. In 1603, the emperor appointed Ieyasu as Seii Tasogun, formalizing his supreme political authority. In 1605, he transferred the title to his son Hidetada, an explicit demonstration that the shogunate was a hereditary Tokugawa institution rather than a personal possession, while continuing to exercise real authority himself until his death in 1616. With Tokugawa Ieyasu's victory at Sekigahara in 1600 and his appointment as shogun in 1603, Japan entered an age that would last more than 2.5 centuries without significant internal warfare, a period of domestic peace unprecedented in Japanese history. The Edo period, named after the Tokugawa capital that grew from a modest fishing village into one of the world's largest cities over the following century, lasted from 1603 to 1868 and represents one of the longest periods of sustained domestic peace achieved by any major political system in the pre-modern world. The cornerstone of this extraordinary stability was the Tokugawa political system, a carefully designed structure of mutual oversight, mutual constraint, and managed dependency that prevented any individual daimyo or coalition from accumulating the military and economic resources necessary to challenge shogunal authority. The Sankenkatai system alternate attendance, formalized in the Bukushohato, laws for military houses, of 1635, required each of the approximately 270 daimyo to spend alternating years in Edo and in their home domain, leaving their families as permanent residents in Edo during the periods when they were at home. This arrangement served multiple simultaneous strategic functions. The permanent presence of daimyo families in Edo provided high-value hostages that made rebellion extraordinarily costly. The requirement of maintaining 2 full establishments, a domain residence, and an Edo mansion, combined with the expenses of the processions, Sankenkatai processions, could involve hundreds or thousands of retainers and required elaborate ceremonial hospitality along the Tokaido and other highways, consumed approximately a quarter to a third of most domains' income, systematically limiting the financial resources available for independent military buildup. And the regular movement of daimyo and their retinues along Japan's highway network created economic activity that sustained the castle towns, post stations, and roadside communities that dotted the major routes. Edo itself grew with remarkable speed under these institutional pressures. The city that Ieyasu had chosen as his capital, a choice that reflected both the strategic desirability of the Kanto Plains' agricultural productivity and the political wisdom of distancing the center of shogunal power from the cultural and aristocratic influences of Kyoto, had a population of perhaps 10,000 in 1600. By 1700, it was a city of approximately 1 million inhabitants, among the 5 largest cities in the world at that date, comparable in scale to London, Paris, or Istanbul. By 1750, some estimates place Edo's population at 1.3 million, making it almost certainly the most populous city in the world at that time. The demands of this enormous city feeding it, supplying it with fuel, clothing, construction materials, entertainment, and the services required by a population that included several 100,000 samurai retainers alongside merchants, artisans, and service workers of every description, created an economic engine of extraordinary productivity that linked Edo through complex commercial networks to every agricultural region of the archipelago. The Ritsario legal system inherited from the Asuka era was replaced and substantially elaborated under the Tokugawa shogunate, which promulgated a succession of legal codes, the Kujikata Osadamegaki of 1742, being the most comprehensive, that regulated the conduct of samurai, adjudicated property disputes, and established criminal procedures with considerable sophistication. The Edo period legal system was not uniform across Japan. Each domain maintained its own laws and courts for internal matters, but the shogunate's codes established national standards for the most important categories of legal matter, creating something approaching a rule-based legal order in a society that had for centuries been governed primarily by the arbitrary authority of local military power. The Tokugawa approach to Christianity was its systematic and ultimately violent suppression, one of the defining features of the regime's religious policy. Christian missionaries had entered Japan during the late 16th century and had achieved remarkable success. By the early 17th century, estimates of Japanese Christian converts ranged between 200,000 and 500,000 people, concentrated particularly in Kyushu, but present throughout the country. The Tokugawa shogunate's hostility to Christianity reflected multiple concerns: the potential loyalty of Japanese Christians to the Pope in Rome rather than to the shogun in Edo, the connections between the Christian missions and the Portuguese and Spanish traders who competed with the Dutch for Japan's overseas commerce, and the broader concern about any institution that organized people across class and regional lines in loyalty to an authority external to the Japanese political order. The persecution that followed, with torture, public crucifixion, and the practice of fumi, requiring suspected Christians to tread on images of Christ or the Virgin to demonstrate apostasy, was systematic and ferocious, culminating in the Shimabara Rebellion of 1637 to 1638, when approximately 37,000 Christian peasants and ronin took refuge in the Hara Castle in Kyushu and were killed to the last person after a 3-month siege that required over 100,000 shogunal troops to resolve. The long peace of the Edo period created the conditions for one of the most extraordinary flowerings of urban popular culture in world history, while aristocratic and religious cultural traditions continued in their established forms. No theater, temple architecture, Zen gardens, the tea ceremony, the new social reality of Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto generated something genuinely unprecedented: a mass commercial culture produced by and for the townspeople, chonin, of Japan's rapidly growing urban centers, creating the literary, theatrical, and artistic forms that most of the world now thinks of when it thinks of traditional Japanese culture. The floating world of Edo, the Ukiyo, the world of ephemeral pleasures, found its most concentrated expression in the licensed pleasure quarters that the Tokugawa system had designated and regulated as controlled spaces for the entertainment industry. The Yoshiwara district of Edo, established in 1617 and rebuilt on a new site after the Great Mereki Fire of 1657, was both a functioning commercial entertainment district and a cultural world unto itself, with its own hierarchies, fashions, aesthetic standards, and artistic patronage. The high-ranking courtesans of the Yoshiwara, the Taiyu, and the Kaise were not merely sex workers, but cultural icons whose mastery of poetry, music, calligraphy, and elegant conversation made them in some respects the successors of the Heian court ladies as arbiters of taste and style. Their fashions were followed by townswomen throughout the city. Their portraits appeared in the woodblock prints that circulated to every part of Japan, and the detailed etiquette of engagement with the pleasure quarter provided a rich vocabulary of cultural reference for writers, artists, and audiences. Kabuki theater, which developed from the early 17th century through the work of female performers, initially organized by the dancer Izumo no Okuni around 1603, and then, after female kabuki was banned by the shogunate in 1629, through the tradition of wakashu, youth kabuki, and finally through the all-male kabuki tradition that has continued to the present, became the defining theatrical form of Edo popular culture. Unlike No, which required years of specialized training to appreciate and was associated primarily with the samurai elite, kabuki was designed from the beginning for mass audiences, boisterous, participatory, spectacular in its use of elaborate costumes. Theatrical machinery, including the Hanamichi runway that extended through the audience and the revolving stage that allowed rapid scene changes, and the intensely stylized, physical technique of its performers. The great kabuki actors, figures like Ikikawa Danjuro I, who created the aragoto, rough stuff, style of exaggerated superhuman heroes, and his counterparts in the wagoto, soft stuff, style of romantic leading men, were celebrities of the first order, their performances greeted with the shouted appreciations, keiko, of devoted fans, and their portraits by the great ukiyo-e masters distributed throughout the city. The woodblock print tradition, known as ukiyo-e, pictures of the floating world, produced during the Edo period, some of the most immediately recognizable artworks in all of Japanese culture, and, through their enormous influence on 19th-century European art, Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, and Art Nouveau, were all profoundly shaped by the Japanese prints that arrived in Europe after 1858 in all of world culture. Morinobu Hishikawa, working in the late 17th century, is generally credited with establishing ukiyo-e as an independent artistic tradition. Kitagawa Utamaro's Biginga, pictures of beautiful women, elevated the genre to a sophistication of psychological observation that rivals any portraiture tradition set. But it was Katsushika Hokusai, 1760 to 1849, and Utagawa Hiroshige, 1797 to 1858, who produced the landscape prints that have become most globally famous. Hokusai's 36 views of Mount Fuji, 1831 to 1833, including the iconic The Great Wave off Kanagawa, and Hiroshige's 53 stations of the Tokaido, 1833, created a visual vocabulary for Japanese landscape that has influenced the far world's perception of Japan more profoundly than any other single artistic achievement. The haiku tradition reached its definitive form through the genius of Matsuo Basho, 1644 to 1694, whose 17-syllable poems, the shortest complete poetic form in any literary tradition, achieved a depth of emotional and perceptual resonance that has made them central to Japanese cultural identity and increasingly influential in world poetry. Basho's most famous poem, the frog poem, Furuike Ye /Kawazu Tobikomu /Mizu no Oto, an old pond a frog jumps in the sound of water, achieves in 17 syllables and 2 moments of perception, the old, still pond and the sudden sound, a quality of meditative immediacy that requires entire paragraphs of critical prose to approach adequately. His travel writings, particularly the Oku no Hosomichi, Narrow Road to the Deep North, recording his journey through the north of Japan in 1689, combine prose and poetry in a form that has no exact equivalent in any other literary tradition, creating a meditative record of travel through the physical landscape and through interior experience simultaneously. One of the most distinctive features of the Tokugawa era was Japan's policy of controlled isolation from most of the outside world's sakoku, a closed country system which shaped Japanese development profoundly from the 1630s until the forced opening of 1854. The origins of sakoku lay in the Tokugawa regime's growing concern about the destabilizing potential of foreign contact, above all Christianity's capacity to organize Japanese people across class and regional lines in loyalty to an external religious authority. The expulsion of the Portuguese in 1639, following the Shimabara Rebellion, combined with existing restrictions on Spanish activity and the earlier expulsion of the English in 1623, left only the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, as the permitted Western trading partner, confined to the artificial island of Deshima in Nagasaki Harbor, roughly 120 meters by 70 meters in area, where their activities were minutely supervised by shogunal interpreters and inspectors. Through this extraordinarily narrow aperture and through parallel contacts with China, through Nagasaki and Korea via the Tsushima domain, Japan maintained a selective engagement with the outside world that served the Tokugawa regime's goals of stability, while permitting the controlled flow of useful knowledge and goods. The Dutch merchants brought textiles, sugar, and mechanical curiosities. They also brought books, instruments, and the fragments of European scientific and technical knowledge that eventually cohered into the phenomenon known as Rangaku Dutch learning. The Rangaku tradition began as a purely practical enterprise. Shogunal officials needed Dutch-speaking interpreters to manage the Deshima trade, and these interpreters naturally became conduits for information about the outside world that their employers found useful. Medical knowledge was the first major field of Western learning to penetrate Japan through this channel, not surprisingly, given that the practical benefits of effective medical treatment are immediately visible in a way that abstract scientific theory is not. The publication in 1774 of Kaitai Shinsho, New Book of Anatomy, by Sujata Genpei and his colleagues, translated from a Dutch edition of the Flemish anatomist Johann Adam Culmus's Ontleed Kundige Taflan, was a landmark event. Sujita had arranged to attend the dissection of an executed criminal alongside two colleagues, specifically to compare what they observed with the illustrations in the Dutch anatomical text. The match between the European diagrams and the actual human anatomy was striking far superior, in their judgment, to the Chinese anatomical models that Japanese medicine had relied on for centuries. The realization that careful empirical observation could yield more accurate knowledge than received tradition was philosophically as significant as any specific anatomical discovery the text contained. By the late 18th century, Rangaku had developed into a recognized intellectual tradition with its own institutions, publications, and practitioners. Hiraga Genai, 1728 to 1780, experimented with electricity using Dutch-imported instruments, operated silk reeling and mining equipment using Western techniques, and wrote satirical fiction that combined Dutch learning with domestic social commentary in an eclectic genius that anticipates later Meiji polymaths. Ino Tadataka, 1745 to 1818, produced the first accurate large-scale maps of the Japanese coastline using surveying techniques that combined traditional Japanese methods with principles derived from Dutch scientific texts, completing a 17-year project that involved walking the entire coastline of Japan and producing maps so accurate that they would remain in use for decades after the Meiji Restoration. The establishment of the Shohizaka Gakumanjo in Edo in 1797 as an official government academy and the subsequent growth of Dutch learning schools in various domains reflected the Rangaku tradition's transition from private scholarly activity to institutionally supported intellectual enterprise. By the early 19th century, scholars at the Tekiduku School, established by Ogata Kon in Osaka, where Fukuzawa Yukichi, later one of the most important intellectuals of the Meiji era, would study in the 1850s, were providing rigorous education in Western medicine, science, and technology that prepared a generation of students for the challenges of the Meiji modernization period. The Tokugawa Shogunate had endured for more than 2.5 centuries, longer than any other military government in Japanese history. It had pacified the country after the chaos of the Sengoku Wars, built an intricate system of political control, and presided over an era of unprecedented domestic peace. Yet by the early 19th century, the signs of structural strain had become unmistakable. Economic contradictions, social unrest, ideological challenges, and mounting foreign pressure combined to push the regime toward collapse. The economic foundations of the Tokugawa order were undermining themselves. The regime had been built on an agrarian foundation with wealth measured in koku of rice and samurai stipends fixed in those terms. As commerce and markets expanded with the long peace, money became increasingly central to the economy. Merchants officially ranked lowest in the social hierarchy, accumulated great fortunes by managing rice exchanges, providing credit, and distributing goods across the archipelago. The Mitsui trading house established in 1673 by Mitsui Takatoshi, who created the revolutionary practice of fixed prices and cash payment rather than the credit and relationship-based system that had previously dominated, grew to become one of the wealthiest commercial enterprises in the world, while remaining officially subordinate to the samurai class, whose members owed it money. This inversion undermined the ideological foundations of the Tokugawa hierarchy with a persistence that no sumptuary law could prevent. Periodic famines exposed the vulnerability of an agricultural economy subjected to the additional instability of market price fluctuations. The Tenmei famine of 1782 to 1788 killed approximately 900,000 to 2 million people. Across northeastern Japan, proportionally one of the most devastating famines in Japanese history. The Tenpo famine of 1833 to 1836 caused comparable mortality, triggering rice riots in Osaka in 1837, led by Oshio Hayakairo, a former shogunal official. That shocked the regime by demonstrating that challenge could come from within its own administrative class. These crises were met with the Kyoho, Kansei, and Tenpo reform programs that sought to restore stability through fiscal austerity, moral regulation, and agricultural improvement with consistently limited success. Into this context of internal strain came the arrival of Commodore Matthew Perry in July 1853. The squadron of 4 vessels, 2 steam-powered sidewheel frigates, the Susquehanna and the Mississippi, and 2 sailing sloops that entered Edo Bay on July 8 represented a technological gap between the American Navy and Japanese defenses that was so stark as to make conventional military response literally impossible. The steam frigates could move independently of wind and tide, making them immune to the traditional coastal defense techniques of Japanese naval warfare. Their long-range cannon could reach the shore from distances beyond the effective range of any Japanese weapons. The psychological effect of these machines, belching black smoke from their funnels, moving against the wind without visible means of propulsion, was profound and immediate. Perry's demand was simple: that Japan open its ports to American vessels for resupply and trade, beginning with 2 ports accessible to the American whaling fleet that operated throughout the Pacific. He delivered the demand in the form of a letter from President Millard Fillmore to the Japanese emperor. The letter was written on vellum, enclosed in a rosewood box with gold clasps, and delivered with deliberately theatrical ceremony, and then departed, promising to return with a larger fleet the following year to receive Japan's response. The shogunate's response to Perry's demand was to consult widely, an unprecedented step that itself signaled its uncertainty. For the first time, the regime solicited the opinions of the daimyo on a matter of foreign policy, distributing copies of Perry's letter for their response. The replies showed Japan deeply divided. Some argued for capitulation to avoid a war Japan could not win, others advocated military resistance, regardless of cost, and others proposed more nuanced strategies of temporary concession, while building military strength for future resistance. No consensus emerged. Perry returned in February 1854 with a substantially larger fleet of 9 vessels and, after several weeks of negotiation, signed the Convention of Kanagawa on March 31, 1854, opening the ports of Shimoda on the Izu Peninsula and Hakodate in Hokkaido to American vessels. Within 18 months, similar conventions had been signed with Britain, Russia, and the Netherlands. The Ansei Treaties of 1858, negotiated by Townsend Harris, the first American consul to Japan, with the shogunate against the wishes of many daimyo and the imperial court in Kyoto, went much further, opening 5 ports to trade, establishing diplomatic representation, and granting extraterritorial privileges to Western nationals in Japan. These unequal treaties, so called because their terms benefited Western powers without reciprocal advantages for Japan, became a source of national humiliation and political grievance that would motivate reformers and revolutionaries for the following decade. The crises unleashed by the arrival of the black ships and the signing of the unequal treaties reached their climax in the late 1860s when the centuries-old Tokugawa shogunate finally collapsed. What replaced it was not simply a new government, but a profound transformation in Japanese history, the Meiji Restoration, which marked the restoration of imperial power, but in reality created an entirely new political order that sought to modernize Japan rapidly and redefine its place in the world. The path to restoration was paved by mounting opposition to the Tokugawa regime from 2 domains above all: Satsuma in southern Kyushu and Choshu in western Honshu. Both were domains with strong traditions of semi-autonomy and deep historical resentments of Tokugawa dominance. Choshu was the domain of the Mori family, who had been the primary losers of Sekigahara in 1600 and had maintained their anti-Tokugawa orientation for 2.5 centuries. Both had modernized their military forces during the 1860s, importing Western rifles and training troops in new infantry tactics. The Choshu domain in particular had learned through painful direct experience. Its shore batteries had been destroyed by a combined Western naval bombardment in 1864, following its attempt to close the Shimonowski Strait. Foreign shipping that modern Western weapons were categorically superior to traditional Japanese military technology. The Boshin War of 1868 to 1869 that overthrew the Tokugawa regime was won not by the ideological power of the Sano Joi, "Revere the Emperor, expel the barbarians," slogan that had initially animated the anti-Tokugawa movement, but by the military superiority of Satsumo Choshu forces, equipped with modern rifles and artillery, against Tokugawa armies, still equipped primarily with traditional weapons. The key battle of Toba-Fushimi in January 1868, where perhaps 3,000 imperial coalition troops, equipped with modern weapons, defeated 8,000 shogunal forces, was decided in part by a single field gun battery that the Esaituma forces deployed with devastating effect against Tokugawa formations unused to artillery fire. The shogun Yoshinobu recognizing that continued resistance would simply result in greater destruction without changing the outcome, decided to end the resistance and negotiate a peaceful resolution. Negotiated the bloodless surrender of Edo Castle in May 1868, a decision negotiated primarily through the personal authority of the Esetuma military commander Seigo Takamori, who engaged directly with the shogunal representative Katsu Kaishu. The new Meiji government, named after the era name, Meiji, meaning enlightened rule, adopted when Emperor Meiji began his personal reign in 1868, moved with extraordinary speed and determination to transform Japan's institutions. The proclamation of the Five Charter Oath on April 6, 1868, established the basic orientation of the new government: deliberative assemblies, broad participation in governance, the abandonment of traditional customs when necessary, the adoption of knowledge from throughout the world, and the seeking of wisdom globally. The abolition of the domains and the Han system in 1871, replaced by a centralized prefectural system directly governed from Tokyo, eliminated the feudal political structure at a stroke. The samurai class was systematically dismantled through the commutation of stipends into government bonds, 1874 to 1876, and the Sword Abolition Edict of 1876, which banned the public carrying of swords, the defining symbol of samurai status. The conscript army, created by the Military Conscription Ordinance of 1873, replaced samurai military service with a national army drawn from all classes, establishing the principle that military service was a civic obligation of all male Japanese citizens. The Iwakura Mission of 1871 to 1873, a diplomatic mission of 48 officials, headed by the senior statesman Iwakura Tomomi, and, including many of the leading figures of the new government, spent 21 months traveling through the United States and Europe, visiting government institutions, factories, schools, hospitals, courts, and military establishments with the explicit purpose of gathering information for Japan's own modernization. The mission spent 7 months in the United States, 4 months in Britain, and several weeks each in France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Prussia, and other countries. It returned, having identified Prussia's model of constitutional monarchy with strong executive authority as the most relevant model for Japan's political development, a conclusion that would shape the Meiji Constitution of 1889, drafted primarily by Ito Hirobumi with reference to the Prussian constitution and establishing a constitutional monarchy in which the emperor's authority was described as absolute in principle, while in practice power resided with the oligarchic cabinet and the genro, elder statesman. Economic modernization proceeded on multiple fronts simultaneously. The government built the first Japanese railway in 1872, connecting Shimbashi in Tokyo to Yokohama, a line of approximately 29 kilometers that was opened with enormous ceremony and immediately began transforming commuting patterns and commercial activity in the Tokyo-Yokohama corridor. By 1900, Japan had approximately 6,000 kilometers of railway. Textile manufacturing, centered on silk and cotton, became Japan's first major export industry. The Tomioka Silk Mill, established with French technical assistance in 1872, introduced the mechanized reeling technology that allowed Japanese silk production to compete in global markets. By the 1890s, Japan was the world's largest exporter of raw silk, with the industry employing hundreds of thousands of women workers in factories across the country. The Osaka Spinning Company, founded in 1882 with English ring spinning technology, became the nucleus of a cotton textile industry that would eventually compete with British cotton manufacturers in Asian markets. The educational reform was perhaps the most lasting achievement of the early Meiji period. The Education Order of 1872 established a national system of compulsory elementary education 4 years minimum that aimed for universal literacy within a generation. By 1880, approximately 40% of school-age children were attending school regularly. By 1905, that figure had risen to 95%, giving Japan one of the highest literacy rates in the world and creating the educated, adaptable workforce that rapid industrialization required. Imperial universities were established in Tokyo, 1877, Kyoto, 1897, Tohoku, 1907, and Kyushu, 1911, drawing on Western university models while training Japanese professionals in law, medicine, engineering, and science. The slogan Wakan Yosai, Japanese spirit, Western techniques, captured the Meiji Project's fundamental ambition. to acquire the technical capabilities of Western civilization without abandoning the cultural identity and political values that made Japan distinctly Japanese. By the closing decades of the 19th century, Japan's rapid modernization had already astonished the world. In just one generation, after the Meiji Restoration, the country had dismantled its feudal order, built railways and factories, introduced universal education, established a modern constitution, and created a conscript army and navy modeled on European powers. Yet for the Meiji leaders, modernization was never an end in itself. It was a means to secure national independence in an age when Western empires were carving up much of Asia and Africa, and to demonstrate that Japan could stand as an equal among the great powers. The First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895 was the first test of Japan's modernized military against a major power. China under the Qing dynasty was widely regarded as one of the great empires of Asia, yet it had similarly been forced to accept humiliating unequal treaties with Western powers and had undertaken its own modernization program, the self-strengthening movement, with considerably less success than Japan's. The war began over competing influence in Korea and was decided within 8 months by Japan's comprehensive military superiority in organization, training, and equipment. The Treaty of Shimonoseki of April 1895 awarded Japan Taiwan, the Pescadores Islands, and the Liaodong Peninsula, including Port Arthur, along with a substantial cash indemnity and the recognition of Korean independence from Chinese suzerainty. The Triple Intervention of April 1895, in which Russia, Germany, and France collectively pressured Japan to return the Liaodong Peninsula to China, ostensibly to preserve peace, but primarily to prevent Japanese establishment on a peninsula that Russia coveted, produced deep national humiliation and hardened Japanese determination to build sufficient strength to resist such pressure in the future. The slogan Gashi-Shintai, lie low and wait, captured the national mood of patient accumulation of strength for the confrontation that most Japanese leaders considered inevitable. That confrontation came in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, which remains one of the most strategically significant conflicts of the early 20th century. Russia's imperial expansion into Manchuria and Korea, combined with its acquisition of Port Arthur in 1898 on a 25-year lease, brought Russian and Japanese imperial ambitions into direct collision. Japan's preemptive torpedo boat attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur on the night of February 8 to 9, 1904, followed by a formal declaration of war, opened a conflict that the world generally expected Russia to win by the overwhelming weight of its resources. Instead, Japanese forces besieged Port Arthur for 5 months before its surrender in January 1905, at a cost of approximately 60,000 Japanese casualties. Japanese armies under Marshal Oyama Ibao fought a grinding 4-month campaign in Manchuria, culminating in the Battle of Mukden in February to March 1905, the largest land battle in history up to that point, involving approximately 600,000 combatants. The decisive naval action came at the Battle of Tsushima on May 27 to 28, 1905, when Admiral Togo Hayakiro's combined fleet intercepted the Russian Baltic fleet that had sailed more than 30,000 kilometers from European Russia to relieve Port Arthur, only to find Port Arthur already fallen. Togo's crossing of the Russian fleet's T, maneuvering to present his full broadside to the advancing Russian line in the classic tactical formation, combined with the superior speed, gunnery, and training of Japanese crews, to produce the most complete naval victory since Trafalgar. Of the 38 Russian vessels that entered the battle, 34 were sunk, captured, or interned. Only 3 escaped to Vladivostok. Russia lost over 5,000 killed and 6,000 captured, including the fleet's commander, Vice Admiral Rozhestvensky. The destruction of the Baltic fleet effectively ended Russia's ability to continue the naval war and forced the peace negotiations that produced the Treaty of Portsmouth. Mediated by American President Theodore Roosevelt, the Treaty of Portsmouth of September 1905 gave Japan the Liaodong lease, including Port Arthur, the southern branch of the Chinese Eastern Railway in Manchuria, the southern half of Sakhalin Island, and recognition of Japan's paramount interests in Korea. In 1910, Korea was formally annexed as a Japanese colony, the culmination of a process of increasing control that had been developing since the 1895 war, beginning a 35-year colonial relationship that would leave deep and permanent scars on Korean society and Korean-Japanese relations. The Anglo-Japanese alliance of 1902, the first alliance between a Western power and an Asian state on formally equal terms, marked Japan's diplomatic arrival as a recognized great power. When Japan joined the Allied side in World War I in August 1914, primarily to seize German concessions in China and German island territories in the Pacific with minimal military risk, it emerged from the war as a recognized permanent member of the League of Nations Council. By 1920, Japan had been transformed within 2 generations from the shogunate that signed the Treaty of Kanagawa in 1854 into a major imperial power with colonies, alliances, and a military capability that commanded the respect and, in some quarters, the fear of every other great power in the world. Our long journey through the history of Japan has now reached its conclusion, or rather, the point at which this chapter must close, for Japan's history continues with the turbulence of the 20th century, the Second World War, the occupation and reconstruction, the economic miracle, and the complex society of the present that carries within it the traces of everything we have traced tonight. From the earliest Jōmon settlements on the islands, from the cord-marked pottery and the dogu figurines and the stone circles of 14,000 years ago, through the rice paddies and bronze bells of the Yayoi period, through the keyhole burial mounds and the divine claims of the Yamato court, through the Buddhist temples and the Taika reforms, through the gilded culture of the Heian court and the rise of the samurai, through the Genpei War and the shogunates of Kamakura and Ashikaga and Tokugawa, through the long Edo peace with its woodblock prints and tea ceremonies and floating world, through the shock of the black ships and the extraordinary transformation of the Meiji era, we have traced a story that spans more than 14,000 years. It is a story of resilience, reinvention, and the capacity of a people to preserve their identity, even while adapting to immense change. A story of a civilization at the edge of the world that remained, across all its transformations, unmistakably itself. Now, the pace slows. The voices of daimyo and samurai, peasants and merchants, emperors and reformers grow quieter as we step back. The sounds of marching armies and bustling Edo streets fade into memory. In their place, you might picture something simpler, a quiet shoreline, waves lapping gently as the tide recedes. The lights of great cities dim softly in the distance, leaving behind a hush that belongs only to the night. The gardens of temples are still, gravel paths untouched, lanterns faintly glowing, shadows stretching across moss and stone. In this calm, the sweep of history feels less like a torrent and more like a slow river flowing steadily onward. As we leave behind the chronicles of emperors and shoguns, remember that history is not only about power and conquest. It is also about continuity, about all the ordinary lives, the farmers and fishermen and potters and poets and monks and merchants, whose daily work and daily faith and daily beauty sustained these islands across 14,000 years of human presence.